Introduction. After some centuries of neglect, advanced minds are turning their attention to magic once more. It used to be said that magic was what we had before science was properly organized. It now seems that magic is where science is actually heading. Enlightened anthropology has grudgingly admitted that beneath all the ritual and mumbo-jumbo of so-called primitive cultures, there exists a very real and awesome power that cannot be explained away. Higher psychics now suggests that the universe runs on something more akin to sorcery than clockwork. The magic art itself is undergoing a profound renaissance. More than enough Kabbalistic and Goetic trivia has been harvested from the hallowed British Museum reading room. In this new eon, the thrust of magical endeavor is towards making the actual experimental techniques work regardless of their religious or symbolic associations. The techniques of magic will be the hypersciences of the future. The origin of these arts lies not in medieval or even pagan civilizations, but is to be found in its most developed form in shamanistic cultures. Before history began, humanity knew a strange and terrible power which gradually slipped from its grasp. It now stands on the brink of its rediscovery. This is a book of source material and a work of reference for those who seek to perform group magic or to work as shamanic priests to the community. It is a companion volume to Labor Null, which constitutes a manual of individual sorcery as taught by the IoT, the magical order of the Illuminatis of Thanateros. The sections of this book may be read in any order. It is an encyclopedia of 40 related essays. Ideas which are not fully explained in one section will find clarification in the section from which they originate. New Eon Magic. An ancient Chinese curse runs, "May you live in interesting times." Since the fall of the Roman Empire, there have rarely been more interesting times than these. Whenever history becomes unstable and destinies hang in the balance, then magicians and messiahs appear everywhere. Our own civilization has moved into an epoch of permanent crisis and upheaval, and we are beset with a plague of wizards. They serve a historic purpose for whenever a society undergoes radical change. Alternative spiritualities proliferate, and from among these a culture will select its new worldview. It is for the wizards to determine how that new spirituality will manifest. Most will end up crying in the wilderness or being put to the stake in various ways, but a few will bequeath to humanity a greater gift than they realize. Orthodox, hierarchical, monotheistic religions are a spent force spiritually and intellectually, although there will be some bloody battles before they are completely finished. Science has brought us power and ideas, but not the wisdom or responsibility to handle them. The next great advance that humanity will make will be into the psychic domain. There are many encouraging signs that this is beginning to occur. In this new field of endeavor, we shall rediscover much of the magical knowledge that the ancient shamans once possessed. Of course, we shall know it under different guises, and will eventually expand on their knowledge immensely. There is a twofold aspect to the most important magical work now being done. Foremost is an experimental investigation into the actual techniques as opposed to the mere symbolism of magic. The methods of magic are remarkably uniform throughout history and across cultures. It is time to unearth them and make them work. Secondly, it is essential that what might be called a spirituality of magic is evolved. Magic must have its own flavor, its own worldview, and its own philosophy. There has always been a tendency to regard magic as an antique art. All shamanic systems consider themselves to be the repository of only a fraction of the power and knowledge that their traditions once held. It seems that in the past reality was more chaotic and susceptible to magic. Even astrophysics and biology support the mythical view. To look at the furthest objects in the heavens is to catch a glimpse of some of the earliest events in the universe. Here, cataclysmic events of unbelievable violence and strangeness are occurring. The fossil record shows that our own planet once shook beneath the feet of immense and totally improbable dragons. It does seem that as the universe ages, matter becomes more ordered and sensible, and that the force of magic diminishes. This certainly seems true for the relationship between magic and matter, except for the occasional metal-bending maverick and the odd shaman who still insists on walking over pits of fire. The grosser magical power seems to be receding. This is, however, only half the story. A profound change has occurred, and the magic force is now manifesting with increasing strength on the psychic levels. The creativity of consciousness has mushroomed so enormously that the totality of human ideas seem to double with each decade. Science has not caused this. Science is one of its many side effects, as are parallel explosions in art, music, and general creativity. On the magical level, the psychic powers are becoming much more accessible. Telepathy, clairvoyance, and astral travel were once won only at great cost by an elect few through extreme measures. Now they are within the reach of anyone armed with moderate determination. The beginnings of the new psychic awareness have acquired a definite, subversive flavor. Magic is aligning itself against oppressive forms of order in many fields. Magic is opposed to a psychiatry and medicine designed to patch up the damaged automaton and plug him back into the system. Instead, it would rather that individuals learn to handle their own mental self-defense and treat their bodies with gentler remedies such as herbs. Magic rejects politics as no more than some people's perverse desire to dominate others. It does well to dissociate itself from this monkey squabble and advocates instead personal enlightenment and emancipation, which are the only real safeguards to freedom. Magic is anti-ideological, because the main products of ideological solutions are repression and corpses. Magic is profoundly opposed to religion. Although religion may appear benign when it is in decline, at least half of the madness and violent deaths of history have been caused by mindless adherence to religions. Magic is also opposed to the superstition that the world is wholly material and that men's actions are not intimately interwoven with the psychic sphere. To oppose repressive forms of order, which often impose themselves by evil means, magic aligns itself to a vision of chaotic good. Magic's commitment to the good is reflected in its concern with the individual freedom and consciousness and its interest in all other life forms on this planet. At the highest level, this manifests as some unspecifiable feeling for the vibes, generated by human thought and action. The chaotic aspect of New Eon magic is psychological anarchy. It is a species of Operation Mindfuck applied to ourselves as much as the world. The aim is to produce inspiration and enlightenment through disordering our belief structures. Humor, random belief, counter-information, and disinformation are its techniques. To take an innocuous example, I usually advocate astrology persuasively to ordinary people, but ridicule it to my magician friends. Humor and random belief allow the use of astrology to disorder what people think either way. Does this mean that I am A, lying, B, mad, C, enlightened, or D, aware of our ability to live almost any truth? Group magical experiments. The purpose of structuring group activity with ritual is to generate more power than individual efforts might achieve. Synergistic effects will come into play in a properly synchronized working, and the collective power will exceed the sum of individual powers participating. Group working also makes possible many experiments requiring more than one operator and allows for a division of labor when some participants can contribute abilities which others lack. Group magical work can be performed as a training exercise, as research, or as a procedure for creating effects. No technique is absolutely fail-safe, and so all activities are experimental to a degree. Some exercises may be so totally experimental in concept and execution that it is not possible to say why we are doing them. If it were possible to say why the research was being done, then it would be unnecessary to do it. Specific effects will be the aim of most training exercises and techniques, and it is with these that this chapter is mainly concerned. 4 areas of experimentation will be examined: psychism, ritual, trance, and dream. Aside from synchronizing group activity, ritual also acts as a solemnizing factor. The assumption of ritual dress and paraphernalia serves to mark the transition from ordinary activity to something of importance. A uniform has a further function, that of depersonalization. It helps to reduce the importance of individual personality factors and allows the wearers to relate to each other as functionaries of some principle beyond personal considerations. A full-length black robe with hood is most excellent for this purpose, as is nudity. A blank, featureless mask completes the effect to total anonymity. Group experiments with simple psychism fall mainly into the category of training exercises in telepathy. Several significant considerations apply here. Telepathy is made more effective by the synchronized projection of many operatives to a single target. But a single projector will be more successful than a poorly synchronized mob. Attempts to project or receive a whole string of images to obtain a statistical result is far less effectual than projecting a single image powerfully. Intense momentary concentration on a sigil or symbol is usually best. With repeated attempts, the projecting and receiving capacities become confused and distracted. The so-called astral doorway experiments in which a single operator attempts to divine the symbolic import of a particular image, sigil, or symbol are little more than exercises in creative imagination performed in a light trance. If the experiment is performed simultaneously by several participants, it can become a basis for the exchange of telepathic imagery. Psychic activities can be synchronized by a ritual in which previously arranged signals cue in particular meditations. The group can concentrate on a symbol or mantra, or they can be led through imagery suggested aloud by a leader. Many other methods of raising power will also act to synchronize the participants in a ritual. The essence of magical dance is that it should be a frenetic circumambulation of a circle about a fixed point, accompanied by collective mantrical invocations. Balance is maintained by keeping the gaze fixed on the center point of the circle. Overbreathing, flagellation, and stimulants can also be employed to heighten excitement and gnosis. Sexual arousal is difficult to control and coordinate except on an autoerotic basis, and is more often a feature of the aftermath of an excitatory ritual than a means of stimulating controlled group gnosis. Full rituals of the meditative or ecstatic variety are usually directed towards one of four objectives: enchantment, making things happen directly by magic; evocation, making things happen through the agency of various demons and elementals; invocation, the summoning of various entities and thought forms for the inspiration of their knowledge and conversation; and divination, obtaining knowledge by direct magical means. The simplest way to orchestrate these rituals for group work is for a presiding officer to perform the main ritual sequence and have the participants deliver the visualizations, mantras, ritual movements, and invocations on certain prearranged cues. To be effective, the ritual must work like an automatic mechanism in which power can manifest without distraction or hesitation. A variety of trance states, from mild suggestibility to deep hypnosis, can be used for magical group working. One operator will persuade one or more subjects into a receptive condition by suggesting or invocating, the subject being in a relaxed or lightly drugged condition. The psychic sensor is less active in the trance state, but often acts to block the awareness of magical events from reaching other levels. When the trance state is controlled by another person, this problem can be overcome. The trance candidate can be directed to seek information clairvoyantly and to relate it to the operator. Conversely, the subject's will can be directed to perform a magical act that the sensor would normally prohibit. One danger with trance experiments is that the operator's influence over the subject may gradually extend itself to non-trance states as well. Another is that the memory and imagination can become very active in trance states and begin to delude both operator and subject. For these reasons, trance experiments should be performed infrequently and for objective results only. It is possible to perform group magical experiments on the dream level. The main difficulty with working in dreams is to make the command to act in a particular way on the dream level penetrate to the dream state. Some form of prearranged ritual, incantation, or visualization can serve to impress the desire to act magically into the deeper levels of the mind before sleep. The so-called astral sabbat is the main type of magical experiment performed on the dream level. The participants are arranged to dream of being present in each other's company at some real place with which they are familiar. The participants can either enter sleep in separate locations at a prearranged time or sleep together in one place. In the second case, it may be possible for the first persons to exteriorize in their dream bodies and attempt to astrally awaken the others. The initial purpose of such sabbats is to achieve a common perception. In subsequent experiments, acts of will can be attempted. Sexual attraction can be used to supply a motivating force to meet on the dream level, and flying ointments can assist with the exteriorization process. Levels of consciousness. Since psychology began, people have never tired of devising new ways of compartmentalizing the mind. All these schemes are more or less arbitrary and in no way related to observable structures within the brain. Many schemes merely reflect the moralistic prejudices of those who devise them. Basically, all schemes fail because the complexity of the mind exceeds the sophistication of the scheme. Even such apparently basic divisions into conscious and subconscious are questionable. The entire contents of the mind seem to be subconscious. It's just a matter of recall, and there is a complete scale from the easily accessible to the inaccessible with no reason to draw an arbitrary line at any particular point. Most of what is described as the realm of higher consciousness seems to be a mixture of wishful moralistic thinking and a few of the more obscure and dysfunctional instincts and drives. Neither psychology nor psychiatry has made much headway with attempts to understand how the contents of the mind interact. The cause and cure of madness remain as obscure as ever. Whatever the relationship between the contents of consciousness may be, it is evident that consciousness occurs on a scale of 5 states, herewith gnosis, awareness, robotic, dreaming, and unconsciousness. Unconsciousness has few uses beyond allowing the body to rest and keeping the organism out of harm's way during those hours of darkness for which it is not adapted. Dreaming, which usually, although not invariably, occurs in sleep, has many functions. It allows the mind to digest conscious experience and make emotional adjustments to it. It also provides a window into the psychic dimension and into the less accessible regions of memory. The robotic state allows us to perform all the automatic behavior that waking life demands. Walking, eating, driving vehicles, and all the million other little meaningless tasks which require no thought once they have been learned. Awareness occurs when the mind produces some non-automatic response to a stimulus. Some minds will only be provoked into awareness by unusual outside events. Other minds may be able to self-stimulate themselves into awareness. The degree and duration of awareness that any stimulus provokes may vary from very little to a lot, depending basically on intelligence. The level of gnosis occurs when the mind becomes intensely conscious of anything. This is not the same as thinking intently about something, for in this state of intense awareness, thinking ceases, and the object of consciousness holds the attention of the mind completely. Terror, anger, orgasm, and various quiescent meditations will provoke this condition. The robotic level has come in for a lot of stick from mystics generally. While it is useful to be able to drive a car or walk automatically, it is obviously undesirable to live one's whole life like this. Nevertheless, the robotic level has many other uses. It is into the robotic level that inspiration or clairvoyant impressions often intrude, and it is partly from the robotic level that enchantments are cast, rather than from the awareness level. Most of the world's geniuses have had some sort of robotic hobby or distraction, which they use to create a vacuum in their awareness into which something useful could manifest. Similarly, most methodological forms of divination are designed to occupy the mind with a thoughtless robotic task. Also, when casting enchantments, it is essential that the actual procedure can be performed without having to think about it. Although the awareness level may be the forum in which we refine our methods and theories and experience many of our most meaningful moments, it is often very little use in performing magic. In fact, the more someone is centered in the awareness level, the more difficult magic may be for them. The Gnostic level is the very front of magical powers and mystic states of consciousness. Despite the tidal wave of verbose nonsense that mystical experience provokes on the intellectual plane, it is quite simple to state exactly what Gnosis is and how to reach it. Gnosis is intense consciousness of something, including the ideas of self or nothingness. Most extremes of emotionality, and not just the nice emotions, can initiate it, and so can a profound act of single-pointed concentration on something. This intense consciousness leads mystics into three common errors. It may create the illusion that oneself and the object of concentration are the same thing. It may lead to the conviction that oneself no longer exists, and it may lead to the obsession that the object of concentration is the supreme thing in the universe. Magically, Gnosis is the state which most easily allows the will and perception to reach out and touch realities beyond the mind. The contents of Gnosis are far less interesting than what can be done with it. It is, of course, possible for some activity to be occurring at more than one level of consciousness. The robotic level, for example, continues to function during all but the most arresting moments of awareness, and parts of it still operate even in Gnosis. Most trance and hypnotic states seem to fall somewhere between the robotic and dream levels. I have my suspicions that parts of the dream level are operating without our noticing them when we are awake, much as the stars continue to shine in the daytime without our noticing them. Most people would identify with their robotic or awareness levels. A few artists and madmen might feel most at home in dreaming, and the mystic would locate his real being in the Gnostic level. According to the magical perspective, none of this is true. The self is no more than the point at which the formless life force, or Kia, touches experience, because consciousness occurs only at the Kia-mind interface. We are unable to get at the root of self with ideas. To fill this gap or vacuum, we erect an ego. The ego is an image of self and Kia we build up out of habit. The Kia should be able to find expression at any level and be equally at home in all or none of these states. Magical training is designed to open up the neglected dream level, to provoke an examination of the contents of the robotic level, and to add new programs to it. It should also teach the method of turning awareness on or off at will, and of entering the Gnostic level and acting within it. The normal human life is spent in oscillating between the unconscious and robotic levels, punctuated by odd moments of dreaming and awareness. The magician may well strive to establish a new oscillation between dreaming and awareness with occasional excursions into the robotic and Gnostic levels for specific purposes. Magical combat. The combat of witch doctors and sorcerers occurs either as a result of unresolvable conflicts of professional interest, or else as training exercises or tests of supremacy. If both protagonists are equally skilled, the results are unlikely to be fatal. Combat between magicians and ordinary men, each with his own techniques and weapons, is likely to be as dangerous to either party as combat between ordinary men. Magical combat is to be undertaken with the same seriousness given to considerations of assault, the infliction of distress and disease, grievous bodily harm, and murder. The protagonist who is psychologically unprepared to do these things physically will not accomplish them psychically. Of all possible motives, revenge is the most pointless except as a demonstration and warning to others. Violence is a very blunt instrument, and a little reflection may indicate more effective forms of psychic intervention, such as spells of ligature and binding, or operations to change one's adversary's opinions. Magical attack takes two forms. At long range, telepathic information is sent which makes the target destroy itself. To make a man fall under a vehicle is not impossible. To make a vehicle fall on top of a man is something else entirely. At short range, it is possible to injure or drain an adversary's energy field using one's own. This demands close proximity, usually contact. Magical close combat of this type is not affected by mere will or visualization, but by projecting a force that can actually be felt, usually through the hands. More rarely, the force can be projected through the voice or the eyes or carried on the breath. The force originates in the navel area and is aroused by the disciplines of breath, concentration, visualization, and by sexual disciplines. A part of this force is put into the enemy's body to cause a disruption of vital energies leading to disease and death. The only defenses consist in evading contact or in having sufficient control over one's internal energies to be able to neutralize the effects of the incoming disruptive energy. Psychic vampirism may be an entirely passive and non-deliberate phenomena, as when young persons live intimately with much older people. Vital energies cannot easily be drawn from a weaker person into a stronger sorcerer unless the sorcerer first kills or severely weakens his victim at close range. Long-range magical combat depends on projecting self-destructive impulses telepathically. A number of methods exist for avoiding the dangers inherent in this technique. Foremost among them is getting one's apprentices to do the dirty work. The image of the target wounded in the required manner is used to send the attack. Wax images, photographs, hair, or nail pairings help to form a connection between the visualized image and the target. To focus the sorcerer's psychic energy, the attack is launched from a state of deepest concentration or from a pinnacle of ecstatic excitement. Hate and anger aroused during a full ritual destruction of the image may serve. The magician may inflict pain on himself, imagining it originates from his adversary in order to arouse his fury. A longer method, calling for protracted concentration, is the black fast, in which the psychic energies aroused by fasting are directed with malefic intent at the target. The death fetish is a composite method of attack which can be used at any range. The sorcerer compounds a device to carry his death wish to his enemy. Foul and necrotic ingredients, together with something to represent the foe, are ritually prepared with full magical concentration, during which the sorcerer adds his own psychic force for proximity transmission. The fetish is then placed where the intended victim will come into contact with it. A skilled sorcerer may succeed in projecting a purely etheric entity across space to harass his opponent. Magical attack is usually done by stealth. There is very little point in betraying one's intentions, unless the victim is of a highly nervous, paranoid, or superstitious disposition. The main difficulty with defense from magical attack is that the very act of trying to divine the enemy's precise intention increases one's vulnerability to it. A third party is most useful here. A counterattack on its own is a high-risk strategy if the enemy has already taken the initiative. Riskiest of all is to send back an identical attack. The preparation of an attack inevitably involves generating self-destructive impulses for projection. There is always the risk that this can backfire, and doubly so in this case. The situation is analogous to a duel with grenades. The most effective defenses are provided by sentient or semi-sentient entities. Prolonged obsessive religious activity will, for the ordinary man, create a minor etheric thought form that he may call his god. This effect is partly transferable and explains the difficulty of attacking popular public figures. It is noticeable that when such a figure falls from favor and is stripped of the protective thoughts of his followers, then sickness and death often follow quickly. The sorcerer will create his entities with more deliberation and care. Entities anchored in talismans, amulets, and fetishes are made by concentrating psychic energies in various objects, sometimes aided by sacrifices of blood or sexual secretions. In all forms of actual or suspected magical attack, paranoia can be the worst enemy. It is the height of unwisdom to enter into situations where conflict is the only option left. Magical attack is the direct opposite of occult healing, though it uses similar forces. As with all things, constructive activities are a far greater challenge to our skills than destructive ones. The Rites of Chaos. 5 rites based on the principles of Gnostic New Aeon shamanism are presented here to cover most situations that the priests of chaos may encounter. They are the Mass of Chaos, Initiation, Ordination, Exorcism, and Extreme Unction. The Mass of Chaos is a general rite which may be performed for the purpose of invocation, evocation, enchantment, or consecration. The rite of exorcism is applicable to psychic infestations of persons, places, or objects. The rite of extreme unction, or last rites, may be applied to the dead or dying body of creatures of all species, including our own. The rite of initiation gives the general method for admitting candidates as initiates into inner orders. No rites are given for the creation of adepts or masters, for each seeker must devise his own entrance into these grades and await the recognition of his peers. An outline of the requirements for the attainment of the status of occult priesthood is given together with a rite to complete the process. Each of the rites is given in a general form for adaptation as circumstance demands. Each may be performed by a single operator or by an unlimited number of participants and assistants. The Mass of Chaos. This rite may be performed as a sacrament of invocation to raise a particular manifestation of energy for inspiration, divination, or communion with particular domains of consciousness. It may be performed as an act of enchantment in which spells are projected to modify physical reality. It may also be performed to consecrate magical instruments or evoke entities for later use. The rite consists of a minimum of 6 parts: preparation, statement of intent, invocation of chaos, invocation of Baphomet, oath, and closing. The preparation will include the making ready of the site, the erection of circles and triangles, the placing of instruments and weapons, and the administration of any chemical or botanical elixirs that may be employed to heighten gnosis. Banishing rituals, meditation, circle dances, and other forms of preparatory gnosis may be used to prepare the participants. The statement of intent must be formulated as simply, forcefully, and precisely as possible, holding aloft any material basis that is to be used in the rite. The officiating priest intones the words, "It is our will," and he places his intention here, adding whatever the aim of the rite is to be. The material basis may be some foodstuff for subsequent consecration and consumption. It may be a sigil with which to cast an enchantment, or a talisman, amulet, or fetish for consecration. In the event that the basis is to be a sexual elixir, then the priest or priestess stands empty-handed for the sacrifices to be of their own bodies. The invocation of chaos is effected by a barbarous incantation delivered in conjunction with Gnostic methods of the operator's choice. The supreme animadversion to chaos is given below, together with a translation which is as accurate as possible within the primitive logic structure of the English language. Drawing the sigil of chaos in the air above the circle, and assisted by the visualizations of the same by his assistants. The priest begins. Now first I'm going to read it in the language provided, and then in the translation. Ol sonof varosage gohu, voina, vabzir di tehom quadmona, zir ile iada dies praf, ilaila, zirdo kayafi, kausago, mospele, teloch, panpira, malpirge, kausagi, zazas, nesatanata zazas. In translation, I reign over you, saith the dragon eagle of the primal chaos. I am the first, the highest, that live in the first ether. I am the terror of the earth, the horns of death, pouring down the fires of life on the earth. The last line cannot be translated. The 8-rayed star of chaos radiant is visualized above the circle throughout, and sacrifices of incenses, blood, or sexual elixirs may be made. The invocation of Baphomet. The priest or priestess who is to assume the manifestation of Baphomet attires and visualizes himself in the traditional god form of this power source. Baphomet, as the representation of the terrestrial life current, appears as a horned theriomorphic deity of androgynous, winged, reptilian, mammalian, and human aspect. The priest arouses within himself a resurgence of the chi, or kundalini, or sacred fire snake, as it is variously known. Other participants may assist by delivering such incantations as the incomparable hymn to Pan, by projecting a visualization of the Averse pentagram into the priest, and if need be, by administering the osculum infame. This so-called obscene kiss to the devil's hindquarters has been much misunderstood. All that is required is that one breathes onto the peritoneum, the space between the genitals and the anus, inside of which the kundalini awaits to be aroused. The priest then completes the invocation with the Aeonic litany. In the first Aeon, I was the Great Spirit. In the second Aeon, men knew me as the Horned God, Pangenitor, Panphage. In the third Aeon, I was the Dark One, the Devil. In the fourth Aeon, men know me not, for I am the Hidden One. In this new Aeon, I appear before you as Baphomet, the God before all gods, who shall endure to the end of the earth. The priest as Baphomet now takes any material basis being used as a focus for the rite and consecrates it to the purpose of the ritual by whatever means the god wills in him, perhaps by speech, by gesture, or by some unexpected means. The oath marks the culmination of the rite, holding the material basis aloft. The priest and all participants affirm, "This is my will." If the basis be a sacrament, it is then consumed. If it is a sigil, it is destroyed or hidden, while a consecrated object is then covered and concealed for later use. The closing may necessitate an exorcism of the priest if the trance or possession be deep. Any Baphometic symbols and paraphernalia are removed, and an upright pentagram is drawn over the priest. A full facial lustration with cold water is administered, and he is called forth by his ordinary name until he responds. A final banishing ritual closes the rite. Initiation. Initiation can never be performed according to some set formula. No two candidates will have exactly the same requirements, abilities, and shortcomings. Any order which attempts to initiate by a set formula is displaying a remarkable lack of perception and imagination. Existence itself can be seen as continuous initiation punctuated by periodic death and rebirth, which itself has great initiatory potential. Beyond a certain level, the magician will begin to seek his own initiatory experiences deliberately, or may feel that something inside of himself is pushing him into these experiences. There is no fixed route which one can traverse and become an adept or master automatically. There are too many variables in existence to make a simple equation possible. When a student or neophyte approaches the guardians of an organized body of occult knowledge, he will be required to undergo some form of initiation if he survives an initial period of instruction and assessment. An operation of this type should never be repeated at a so-called higher level. If the adepts of an order are not able to completely satisfy themselves with the candidate and take him fully into their confidence, then they have no business initiating. Orders within orders exist only to manufacture hierarchy for its own sake. The formal initiation will contain all the following elements. An ordeal, to test fortitude and devotion to the order, and to test various abilities that the order may require. An empowerment, with certain secrets, powers, and knowledge that are the property of the order. An induction into the order, which may place certain obligations of duty and secrecy upon the candidate. The unexpected. The order should be capable of engineering some event which will greatly surprise the candidate, overturn his expectations, and force him to think or act in a way which is completely at variance with his normal behavior. The practical joke is in many ways a secular survival of initiation rites, and a reflection of the general cosmic joke being played out continuously in all our particular existences. In past eons, this experience was usually provided by some sort of simulated death and rebirth. There are many variants of it. Hypnosis, hallucinogens, or temporary reduction to total vulnerability can be used. Terror, physical privation, or ecstatic excitement leading to collapse should be employed with a certain prudence, however. Ordeals may also be set to test specific abilities, such as power of divination. The candidate might be asked to give the history of a certain object with which he is presented. He might alternatively be asked to conjure a pentagram with sufficient force that it can be sent and seen by others present. While it would be neither desirable nor possible to give exact initiatory formula, a resume of some of the general methods is presented below. Firstly, some examples of ordeals. The initiatory journey. The candidate is sent or led on a journey, perhaps through a forest, at night, or even across a crowded city. At various points he is met and challenged by various guardians, and also by persons that he will not realize are guardians. Each will make some demand of him which he will have to satisfy before being passed to the next point. Guarding a station. The candidate is assigned to a point that he must not quit on pain of failure. It might be a tree in a wood or even a lamp post in a public place. Various experiences which force him to confront his fears and desires are arranged to tempt the candidate from his post. Magical defense. A circle is drawn on the ground around the candidate. All other officers of the order are outside the circle. No person may cross the circle, and no object which is physical weapon may transit the circle. There are no other rules. Combat ceases if the candidate submits or when the presiding officer is satisfied. Secondly, some examples of empowerments. The candidate may be prepared by fasting, by meditation, and if need be, by various elixirs, and then be shown certain forces and entities that the officers of the order may conjure. Alternatively, the candidate may be placed in trance and led through a series of visions. Group ritual designed to produce heightened or altered states of consciousness may also be performed. The candidate may be taught certain techniques or have some instrument consecrated for his personal use. The inductive phase of an initiation informs the candidate of the order's requirements pertaining to secrecy. Blood, nail, parings, spittle, and the measure, a cord of the candidate's precise head to toe length may be given in pledge. Of what might constitute the unexpected part of an initiation ritual I shall say no more. Whereas the majority of the rite is a test for the order's magical and organizational abilities, engineering the unexpected is a test of the order's creativity. Exorcism. Exorcism is of two types: the exorcism of places or objects, and the exorcism of persons. A possible third type, the exorcism of animals, is rarely encountered and seldom worth attempting, it being extraordinarily difficult anyway. The exorcism of persons does not invariably presuppose that some external entity has taken over the candidate's mind. We are quite capable of manufacturing our own demons through bad mental habits, or in response to peculiar forms of stress. It is only worth attempting exorcism as a cure for madness if the patient specifically complains of some sort of infestation by a seemingly independent entity. Additionally, it is only likely to succeed if the possession began comparatively recently. As the witch doctors say, a man with a bad soul, a long-term mad case, cannot usually be helped. The conventional religious form of exorcism seeks to replace one obsession with a larger and more powerful one. This involves invoking a god to cast out the demon. This can only work if the candidate has been brought up to fear or revere a god. The exorcist must invoke, and to some extent actually personify the candidate's god using all the symbolic words, actions, and paraphernalia that go with it. Then he must command the candidate to abandon his obsession, if necessary, by quite forceful behavior. It may be useful if the exorcist makes a show of actually removing the demon. Some form of symbolic trickery is often used at this point. Psychiatric methods of head doctoring are still incredibly primitive. Most depend on carrot or stick techniques. Carrot therapy depends on being as nice and reasonable as possible to the patient and is sometimes effective over a long period. Stick therapy derives from the medieval practice of flogging demons out of people. In these civilized days, it is usually administered with electricity, the scalpel, or the hypodermic. Its effectiveness is questionable. The techniques of freestyle shamanism offer an alternative to the religious and psychiatric methods. Instead of invoking the candidate's god, the exorcist invokes and personifies the candidate's demon. This approach may be particularly useful with a non-religious candidate. After observing the candidate for some time, the exorcist will take him to some secure place and ensure that he is at his complete mercy. Then the exorcist takes the candidate through a tour of his private hell. Foul and acrid incenses may be burned. Weird flashing illumination and smoke can be employed. The exorcist behaves in a weird and threatening manner, throwing back at the candidate all the peculiarities he has exhibited himself. Effectively, the exorcist terrorizes the candidate back to normality by showing him how far down the slope he has slipped and how much further he might eventually go. Gnostic techniques, that is, the generation of intense mental excitatory ecstasy, or alternatively extreme meditative quiescence, are effective in the exorcism of persons. In either of these two conditions, the mind becomes hypersuggestible, which explains their use in brainwashing. Now, many forms of possession have a sexual or traumatic component. The mental energy associated with sexual arousal or traumatic experiences can often become diverted to feed an obsession until it grows into an independent entity, or attracts an independent entity. Indeed, this is one of the easiest methods by which the magician can breed his own familiar elementals and demons. It is only by returning to a similar level of mental exaltation by various physiological means that such forms of possession and obsession can be challenged and banished. The rite then consists of bringing the candidate through a great catharsis, during which his consciousness can be reprogrammed to reject the offending entity which has been built up. The exorcism of places and objects is of two types. The first is a sham, performed in the presence of persons who require exorcism themselves, but who are unable to come to terms with this fact. The exorcist is likely to be summoned to situations where it is obvious that the problem lies in the inhabitants of the place and not the place itself, as they protest. In this case, the exorcism is performed in their presence with them as the actual target. The exorcist will have to make some pretense of dealing with the place itself, and in this he should ask the affected persons to assist him. As they have already exteriorized the obsessing or possessing force imaginatively, or sometimes objectively, as with poltergeists, etc., the next logical step is for them to take control of it. If there are objective psychic phenomena, such as materializations, noises, sudden temperature falls, or objects hurled about, the exorcist should not immediately conclude the presence of totally extra-human entities. Humans are quite capable of affecting such manifestations while being unaware that they are so doing. If, however, the magician can satisfy himself that some place or object is infested with some psychic energy or entity, then a great opportunity presents itself. Instead of banishing, entrapment can be considered. In general, spirits can be coerced by anything with highly ordered, low-entropy structure. The focused human will, magnetized iron, crystals, and to some extent, very pure water being the most commonly employed agents, the magician will usually begin stalking the entity by providing it with some basis of manifestation, depending on his clairvoyant abilities. He may employ darkness, incense smoke, or hallucinogens to catch some impression of what he is dealing with. A subsequent rite of entrapment centers around the use of a spirit trap, of which by far the most effective are crystals. Salt crystals are often used more or less unknowingly in religious rites, but shamans the world over prefer large, more stable crystals, particularly quartz. Incidentally, ordinary salt is so good at picking up various bits of random low-level psychic debris that many witches and mystics refuse to eat it. Consuming raw salt is somewhat injurious to physical health anyway. Entities may be coerced into crystals by plunging them into the space occupied by a spirit if this can be determined. Coercion by a strong, focused human will, assisted by prods and passes with sharp magnetized iron instruments, can be effective, particularly if the whole operation is concentrated by a ritual. Banishment may be accomplished by simply forcing the entity to leave, or it may be performed subsequent to entrapment. Although it is very common, water is a very anomalous substance. On the molecular level, it is not entirely homogeneous or random, but possessed of a certain delicate structure which is very sensitive to heat, radiation, and psychic ambience. It will receive a psychic charge readily, but will dissipate it equally readily. Hence, in rites of banishing infested salt, crystals are usually dissolved in water for a few days. Another variation on direct banishing is to charge a sample of water and simply splash it around in the vicinity of the entity for its disintegrating effect. The magician may encounter entities which are the psychic remains of human dead. If these still possess any degree of coherence, he may have recourse to various forms of unction, as given in the next section. Extreme unction, the final enchantment. The organic forces which bring a being into physical existence will, inevitably, remove it from existence at some later time. It is neither possible nor desirable to prevent this from occurring eventually. Death is a precondition of life. Without death, human life would no longer be human. Death may be a great initiation or a random catastrophe in which the fruits of an incarnation are largely wasted. At death, there are three parts of a being to be considered: its kya, its etheric body, and its physical body. The latter will degrade at various rates depending on the gruesome superstitions surrounding its disposal in a particular culture. Only religions which are truly afraid of death have contrived the revolting habits of burial in sealed boxes or embalming. In the usual course of events, the etheric body will begin to degrade as the physical body begins to disintegrate. This etheric body, sometimes known as the soul, contains an image of the body and some of its most powerful memories. If death occurs in a highly emotionally charged way, the etheric may contain a memory of that experience also. The disintegrating etheric sometimes gives rise to all manner of quasi-religious experiences in the dying. Each may briefly visit the heaven or hell of his expectation. The etheric may appear as a ghost, and parts of it may become attached to places or objects, and rarely other people. In general, though, it's usually becoming dissipated into the etheric background after a few days. The kya is destined to be reabsorbed into the life force pool of this world, which makes itself known to us as Baphomet. To the mystic, this experience is union with God. To the sorcerer, it is being devoured by the devil, and he seeks deliberately to avoid it. The magician, on the other hand, may well give some consideration to whether he wishes to preserve his individual awareness or not. Absorption in Baphomet explodes the kya into infinitesimal fragments, out of which new kyas will eventually form to inhabit new beings. By magical means, it is possible to get the kya to reincarnate whole without losing its integrity. Such a reincarnation will be unconscious, and no memories will be preserved. Other techniques allow the kya to carry some etheric with it, in which case at least some of the main lessons and memories from one incarnation may be preserved for the next. The magician must decide for himself what course of action he will take for his own soul. When present at or shortly after the death of any creature, the magician has the opportunity to assist as Psychonaut, the guide of souls through the other world. Instructions and encouragement may be given verbally to the dying, but in the case of their being comatose or dead or belonging to other races or species, the magician will have to rely on telepathic visualization alone to put his message across. The essential points, which may be stated in any form the candidate is likely to understand, are these. Be without fear as the great metamorphosis begins. Fantastic and terrifying visions are illusory. Laugh at them and reject them. They cannot touch you now. Go beyond. You will come to the secret of your being, which may seem as a dazzling brilliance, or as an awesome darkness, or as both these things and more. It is your choice to become one with the Source if you so will it. It is your choice to remain separate if you so will this instead. Do what thou wilt. If you would remain separate, then must you seek new life. In seeking rebirth, seek the emanations of love, vitality, and intelligence. Go where there is strength and freedom. Ordination. A magical priest, as distinct from an adept, is someone capable of administering the sacraments and rites of initiation, exorcism, extreme unction, and the Mass, and of discoursing wisely upon mysticism and magic to whomsoever may require these things of him. Most adepts will be able to function as priests unless they are following a particularly solitary path. Initiates will find that acquiring the powers of a magical priest does much to further their progress towards adepthood. Ordination is not conferred by some passive seal of approval, but is given in recognition of the demonstration of certain abilities to one's peers. The order recognizes as ordained priests of chaos those who can demonstrate the following: administration of the Mass of Chaos for invocation, enchantment, and consecration, performance of the exorcism of places and persons to effect, administration of extreme unction to some being whose demise must certainly not have been brought about for this purpose, the design and performance of an initiation, acting as principal officer, the construction and use of magical weapons, psychic ability in enchantment and divination by any preferred method, the ability to enter at least one state of altered consciousness or gnosis at will, the ability to discourse widely, wisely, convincingly, and with authority on magical and mystical matters, and these abilities have to be tested over a period of time. But after satisfactory accomplishment, the candidate proceeds to the rite of ordination proper. For this, he performs the Mass of Chaos for his own magical inspiration and to consecrate his priestly instruments. As many fellow officers of the order as possible will be present to add their own powers to the rite. Magical time. The celestial bodies which exert the greatest physical and psychic effects on the earth are the sun and the moon. The effects of the other planets are minute by comparison and quite unrelated to fanciful attributions to antique gods. Astrology, like any other body of knowledge, seeks to enlarge itself, but in doing this indiscriminately, has become hopelessly vague and imprecise. The planets do influence Earth, but the effects are indirect, as they affect us by affecting the sun, and most of these effects are immeasurably small. The moon does not shine by her own light, but by the reflected light of the sun. In bouncing off the moon, the sun's radiations undergo a change in properties, and on reaching Earth they cast a familiar eerie silver glow over everything they touch. Before the days of the massive psychiatric abuse of tranquilizers, mental hospitals would become veritable bedlams at the full moon. Strong moonlight exerts a general psychophysical, energizing effect on a variety of plant and animal life, whose growth and behavior are influenced by it. There are few things more invigorating than moonbathing, but if the energy is not channeled into something useful, it can tend to intoxicate and derange the moon watcher. Away from civilization, the female menstrual cycle becomes synchronized with the moon's phases. The passage of blood tends to occur at the dark of the moon, but may occur at the full moon. Ovulation will necessarily occur at the opposite phase. At the time of menses, woman is in her most psychical, powerful, and clairvoyant phase. Many authorities consider that the full moon is the time for works of beneficent magic, healing, fertility, and gain, and that the dark of the moon is the time for malignant sorceries. This is only partly true. All magic works somewhat better at the full moon, as there is more psychic energy about. Harmful magic tends to have worse effects on its victims at the dark of the moon, for everyone tends to be at a lower ebb. But conversely, the attack has to be made from a position of lower energy. The exception to this, of course, being women who menstruate at this time. For this reason, many religious and magical systems tend to be fearful of the power of women at this time and exclude them from temples or intercourse with men. On the other hand, some arcane and secretive magical orders have encouraged the use of women's extra psychical powers when menses occurs at the full or dark of the moon, for good or ill respectively. Oral contraceptives now offer a simple method for effecting synchronization with either of the moon's phases as is desired. On the general theme of the timing of any magical act, it is worth noting that the best time to perform any magic to affect others is at 4 in the morning local time. This is the time when the body-mind is at its lowest physiological level. It is the time of dream and the time when most people are born and when most people will die. The yearly seasonal cycle in temperature latitudes exerts a considerable psychic effect through the agency of plant and animal life. The yearly rhythms of sex, growth, death, and decay create a corresponding psychic current, which can probably explain most sun sign astrology and make various types of magic easier at certain times. Springtime energies assist beneficent works such as healing, growth, love, and fertility, these being performed around May Eve, April 30th. Autumnal energies assist such works of necromancy, death, and darkness as may be performed around All Hallows Eve, October 31st. The quality of sun's radiation is periodically disturbed by the presence of sunspots. These are intense magnetic vortexes, which move across the surface of the sun and tend to appear in large numbers every 11 years. They appear darker because they are cooler than the rest of the surface of this raging thermonuclear furnace. The immense energy fields associated with sunspots are measurable here on Earth and often disrupt radio communication. Sunspots have unpredictable effects on Earth. Sunspot maxima are more often than not associated with upheaval and disaster in the affairs of men. Events often move into a crisis phase and great changes begin. The picture is further complicated by a magnetic polarity reversal from one cycle to the next, giving a complete cycle of 22 years. Magically, a time of sunspot maxima is the time to set great changes in motion while events are at their most sensitive and unstable, and the slightest push may have decisive consequences. The last two maxima occurred in 1968 and 1979, marking the onset of optimistic and pessimistic currents respectively. Let us hope that 1990 heralds better times on Earth. It remains to be proved that there is a correlation between the 22 Atu of the tarot and the 22-year cycle. The Fool would presumably represent one node, and the Fortune the second in each cycle. A knowledge of astronomical and temporal cycles ought not act as a restrictive influence on magical activity. Rather, it should suggest times when such arts may be practiced with more than normal efficiency. Chemonosis. Important note. To use drugs of any kind is to poison the body. The difference between sufficient dose and overdose is so variable as to display the danger inherent in the use of toxic substances. The author has undertaken comprehensive study of the use of many different types of drugs in a controlled scientific way, ensuring manifold safeguards and protections during the experiments. Neither the publisher nor the author wishes to incite any reader to the irresponsible use of toxic substances and would advise against their use. However, to omit a survey of this historically important aspect of the workings of magical technique would have been to jeopardize the integrity of the whole book. Chemical agents of natural and manufactured origin have always played a significant role in shamanism and magic. These substances can make various occult powers more accessible, but none of them confers magical abilities by themselves. There are 4 factors which control the outcome of experiments with magical drugs. Firstly, the physiological effects of the drugs themselves. Secondly, the training and abilities of their users. Thirdly, any innate magical forces contained in the substances, and fourthly, any outside magical events which may affect the experience. On the basis of their physiological effects, magically useful drugs can be broken down into 3 categories. Hallucinogens are substances which enhance perception. Hallucinations, as distinct from superior perceptions, occur when the subject has overdosed himself or fails to direct his perceptions to any purpose, and the experience becomes a disordered trip around his imagination. Disinhibitory agents, such as alcohol and hashish, make it easier to attain the Gnostic states of frenzied excitement required in various ecstatic rites. Hypnotic or narcotic substances are those which give rise to various degrees of trance and unconsciousness. Now, most drugs in any of these classes will exhibit all three types of effect at various doses. Small amounts of narcotics are stimulating in many cases, and larger doses may be hallucinogenic. Excessive doses of disinhibitory agents may cause stupor and hallucination. Hallucinogens themselves may be stimulating at small doses but cause trance in larger doses. Furthermore, all drugs will cause poisoning, coma, and death at some level of dosage, although this may only be at extreme levels. The training and abilities of the users of the drugs account for many of the differences of effect noticed at lower dosages. Quantities which may evoke only mild euphoria or nausea in untrained subjects may be sufficient to allow the adept to enter trance or ecstatic states. The directing of perception is also essential if one is to commune with magical phenomena rather than just have a pleasant or nauseating time. The directing of perception can be learned in non-drug meditation, or it can be brought about by the presence of an adept, or it can be caused by magical forces contained in the drug substance. Failure to direct perceptions is the cause of all meaningless and horrific drug visions. There may be innate magical forces in a drug if it is made from a living thing, or if it has been prepared especially to contain some occult force. For this reason, botanical drugs should be collected with the utmost care and respect. In return, the spirit of the species may yield up its secrets to the user. Such knowledge as where to find the plant, what its nature and properties are, curative and otherwise, and a knowledge of other creatures and forces having a relationship to it. Some preparations may contain certain non-drug elements which have occult properties, such as part of an animal with which the sorcerer is seeking communion. When using a refined or purely chemical substance, it is wise to perform an invocation beforehand. At the very least, this will direct one's perception, and it may succeed in placing a magical charge in the substance itself. Outside events may also serve to direct perception. An experienced initiate can lead the neophyte into the correct visions, or demonstrate a particular phenomena to the neophyte's enhanced perception. Now briefly, an exegesis of the magical drugs in common use and their effects. Flying ointments are found at a variety of points in magical history and many cultures. The essential ingredients are a grease base, one or more of the poisonous solanum species, datura, henbane or deadly nightshade, and sometimes aconite or wolfsbane. The ointment is smeared on the forehead and around the thighs and was occasionally applied internally to the female genitalia using a broom handle, hence the myths. The alkaloids of the solanaceae cause drowsiness and unconsciousness, in which hallucinations of flying occur and in which real astral travel is possible. The aconite alkaloids help in the general numbing of the body. All these alkaloids carry a severe risk of fatal poisoning, however, and it is unwise to overdo or ingest the mixture. With this type of drug, it is preferable to use only sparing amounts and then attempt willed astral travel while asleep rather than comatose. A wide range of hallucinogens are available to stimulate magical perception. Synthetics such as LSD do not possess any intrinsic magical quality, but produce dazzling erratic visions, which, although they may be emotionally charged, seem only to reflect the expectations or fears of the user. Because of the fleeting and fantastically distorted nature of LSD experiences, it is notoriously difficult to direct perception of particular visions within it. Whereas in the early days of its use, LSD carried a certain joyous oceanic vibration, nowadays it seems to have acquired an aura of paranoia and madness. Although it is probably impossible to direct the trance to magical ends, nitrous oxide gas produces startling visions of an intensely inspirational nature. It often seems that this simple substance taps the very seat of inspiration itself, but the insights it brings have an infuriating tendency to slip through one's fingers on awakening. Nevertheless, it gives an enticing taste of something approaching formless samadhi. Naturally occurring hallucinogens provide a far richer source of magical perception. Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric toadstool, having a red cap and white spots, contains a variety of alkaloids, including bufotenin, or bufotenine. This substance is also found in glands behind the eyes of certain toads, which may explain their use in medieval witch brews. It is also significant that Amanita muscaria bears the name toadstool. Indeed, it is virtually the archetypal toadstool in folklore, presumably because of this chemical similarity. No toad has ever been seen sitting on one by choice. A similar group of hallucinogenic alkaloids exists in species of small psilocybe mushrooms. Something very strange has happened to this species. There seems to be no reference to them at all in any folklore outside the Americas until recently, very recently. Although virtually every other psychogenic herb and fungus has been known for centuries, psilocybe has remained unknown and catalogued as an uninteresting and seldom found little toadstool. It seems that what we are witnessing here is the sudden proliferation of a viral and hallucinogenic mutant within an otherwise insignificant species. It is to be hoped that after a few years it does not disappear again as mysteriously as it appeared. The little mushrooms produce all the interesting effects of the amanita, but without the unpleasant side effects. They are also highly communicative, if approached with respect, and will show the seeker many aspects of their collective being, as well as giving him glimpses into himself and the universe. With all types of excitatory and trance-inducing drugs, the trick is to use just enough to stimulate the required condition, but not so much that one loses control of it. Trance-inducing substances include narcotics like opium, tobacco, or mandrake decoctions, and various anesthetics like ether and chloroform. Excitatory preparations include alcohol, hashish, and small quantities of hallucinogens. All these substances require an additional ecstatic technique to direct the perception to produce a useful effect. In general, chemical agents are only useful in receptive magic, such as astral travel, divination, and invocation, and after a while the adept should be able to obtain these experiences without chemical assistance. Chemical agents find very little application in more active forms of magic such as sigil casting and enchantment. In magical combat, their use may prove disastrous. An afterthought. I would not counsel anyone to tread too deeply in the mire of alchemy, but the black elixir of that tradition was almost certainly essence of toad. Note: all drugs are poisons, and the previously mentioned substances are capable of acting as lethal toxins. With many natural psychoactives, the difference between a fatal and a merely psychoactive dosage is impossible to assay by amateur methods. These techniques are mentioned only for the sake of historical completeness. Magical perspectives. Physical processes alone will never completely explain the existence of the universe, life, and consciousness. Religious answers are just wishful thinking and wanton fabrication cast as a veil over a bottomless pit of ignorance. To explain their occult and mystical experiences, magicians are forced to develop models beyond the scope of materialistic or religious systems. To the magician, it is self-evident that there is some other level of reality than the purely physical. Medieval magicians thought that their powers emanated from God or the devil. In fact, magic works equally well in any god's name, for good, evil, neutral, or indifferent motives. Whatever the nature of the other reality, there is obviously no need, beyond the psychological, to anthropomorphize it. Many scientific disciplines begin by not observing any sort of vital spark or consciousness in material events and proceed to deny that these things exist in living beings, including themselves. Because consciousness does not fit into their mechanistic schemes, they declare it illusory. Magicians make exactly the reverse argument. Observing consciousness in themselves and animals, they are magnanimous enough to extend it to all things to some degree. trees, amulets, planetary bodies, and all. This is a far more respectful and generous attitude than of religions, most of whom won't even give animals a soul. The magical view of mind differs radically from scientific and religious ideas. From a religious point of view, we are variously the willing, unwilling, or unknowing playthings of the gods. Alternatively, we are partly of God and partly of the devil, or partly of God but mostly evil by choice. Again, moralistic thinking obscures ignorance. There is actually no scientific view of mind at all. There is only psychology. So we must contrast this with materialistic views in general. The contrast is an odd one. Psychology claims that when something happens to people, stimulus, they do something, response. What causes one person to give a particular response and another person a different one is their ego. The general materialistic view, on the other hand, is the assumption that we have free will. Am I my ego, or am I my free will? This ancient problem is insoluble because it's wrongly phrased. Magic offers an alternative view. Consciousness occurs when the kya, which is equivalent to free will and perception but itself formless, touches materiality, the ego, mind, sensory and extrasensory information, etc. So we have both of these things, but we are neither of them. We experience our being only at their place of meeting. A general overview of the magical interpretation of existence appears in the following sections on chaos, Baphomet, Choronzon, and the psychic censor. A more detailed exposition of technical occult theories appears in the chapter on magical paradigms. Chaos, the secret of the universe. May it not be that consciousness, magic, and chaos are the same thing? Consciousness is able to make things happen spontaneously without prior cause. This usually happens within the brain, where that part of consciousness we designate will tickles the nerves to make certain thoughts and actions occur. Occasionally, consciousness is able to make things happen spontaneously outside the body when it is performing magic. Any act of will is magic. Conversely, any act of conscious perception is also magic. An occurrence in nervous matter is spontaneously perceived in consciousness. Sometimes that perception can occur directly without the use of the senses, as in clairvoyance. Magic is not just confined to consciousness. All events, including the origin of the universe, happen basically by magic. That is to say, they arise spontaneously without a final prior cause. Matter gives the appearance of being governed by physical laws, but these are only statistical approximations. It is not possible to give a final explanation of how anything happens in terms of cause and effect. At some level, the event must have just happened. This might seem to give rise to a completely random and disordered universe. Not so. Throw a single die and you might get anything. Throw 6 million and you will get almost exactly 1,000,000 sixes. There is no reason for the laws of the universe, represented here by the structure of the dice. They too are phenomena that have just arisen spontaneously and may one day cease to apply if spontaneity produces something different. Now it is very difficult to imagine events arising spontaneously without prior cause, even though this happens every time one exerts one's will. For this reason, it has seemed preferable to call this root of phenomena chaos. It is impossible for us to understand chaos, because the understanding part of ourselves is built out of matter, which mainly obeys the statistical form of causality. Indeed, all our rational thinking is structured on the hypothesis that one thing causes another. It follows then that our thinking will never be able to appreciate the nature of consciousness or the universe as a whole, because these are spontaneous, magical, and chaotic by nature. Now, it would be unjustified to infer from this that the universe is conscious and can think in our sense of the word. The universe is the thoughts of chaos, if you like. We may be able to understand the thoughts, but not the chaos from which they arise. Similarly, we may be accustomed to being conscious and exerting our will, but we shall never be able to form ideas of what these are. Each of the major human philosophies attempts to answer a particular question about existence. Science asks how and discovers chains of causality. Religion asks why and invents theological answers. art asks which and comes up with the principles of aesthetics. The question that magic seeks to answer is what, and it is thus an examination of the nature of being. If we proceed straight to the heart of the matter and ask of magic, what is the nature of consciousness and the universe and everything, we get this answer. They are spontaneous, magical, and chaotic phenomena. The force which initiates and moves the universe, and the force which lies at the center of consciousness, is whimsical and arbitrary, creating and destroying for no purpose beyond amusing itself. There is nothing spiritual or moralistic about chaos and Kia. We live in a universe where nothing is true, although some information may be useful for relative purposes. It is for us to decide what we wish to consider meaningful or good or amusing. The universe amuses itself constantly and invites us to do the same. I personally applaud the universe for being the stupendous practical joke that it is. If there were a purpose to life, the universe and everything, it would be far less amusing. We could only go sheepishly along with it or fight an heroic but futile battle against it. As it is, we are free to grasp whatever freedoms are available and do whatever we fancy with them. It may be that theology and even metaphysics are just bad lyric poetry, but here goes anyway. Chaos. The word must be spoken, though only the untruth of it shall be known. The blasphemy of it shall be our liberation. Change is the only constant phenomenon. Oh, let me worship the randomness of things, for all that I have ever loved has come forth from it, and will be taken away by it. Chance! Hail also unto apparent order, for it increaseth the possibilities of chaos. There can be no absolute truth in a universe of relativities. All things are arbitrary. Some things have relative truth for a time. Life being accidental, we are free to give it any point we like. I do not find it necessary to account for my actions, even unto myself. I require no justification. That I do it is sufficient in itself. Life is its own answer. My spirituality is the way I live it. I will believe whatever brings me joy, power, and ecstasy. Understanding cannot understand itself. Perception cannot perceive itself. Will cannot unwill itself. The secret of the universe is the secret of the universe, known to me in the silences and in the storms. Baphomet. What is God? We may well ask, since the question has been obsessing our species ever since it came up with the notion. The question has become a whole new ballgame since the invention of the telescope. If the Earth were reduced to the size of a grain of sand, then the universe would still be unimaginably vast on the same scale. The furthest observed objects would still be a long way off. Not yards or even several miles, but still at least several thousands of billions of miles. Our world, a grain of sand in 1,000 billion miles of space. It is most unlikely that whatever creates on this scale takes a personal interest in what we had for breakfast. As a species, we only started to form pretentious theories about cosmic gods when we mixed up our own megalomaniac psychology with the vestiges of shamanistic knowledge. The monotheistic God is only an idealized image of ourselves, or our fathers, or our kings writ large. The perspective of the telescope now indicates that this idea was childishly small. No wonder the Inquisition burned astronomers. Nevertheless, before the monotheistic errors were made, our species had arrived at a sophisticated appreciation of the psychic structure of our own little corner of the universe. In the first shamanistic eon, men recognized the animating spirit of living beings. It was often depicted as a horned god, a man with antlers. It was a force without morality, and it could not be bargained with nor placated. However, by careful observation, mediation, and training, it was possible to give oneself and one's tribe a psychic edge in a hostile environment by its appreciation. These early psychic abilities, coupled with the high intelligence, rapidly made the puny humans into the planet's most successful species. The force that made this possible was universally symbolized as the horned god. Horned because it conferred certain powers over animals, and a horned man because it represented something extra which men could acquire. The double horns symbolized the bipolar nature of a force which was both good and evil, light and dark, beautiful and terrible. Furthermore, the horned god image gives an impression of the awesome and fearful nature of this type of power. Agriculture and the beginning of settled life in city-states ushered in the pagan eon. Man lost touch with many aspects of this force which related directly to nature and began to construct all manner of improbable polytheistic and pantheistic theories to account for the behavior of himself and his environment. Knowledge became fragmented, and aspects of the force were personified as various deities. Superstition and mere religion became rife. The original magical lore and abilities survived in places, but became unofficial or even went underground. In the monotheistic eon, religion became a fully institutionalized instrument of the state. The singular gods of the period were designed to give divine sanction to the secular and priestly powers and to provide a model for the ideal citizen. The ancient magical life force could hardly supply the basis for these new gods. Instead, Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, and Buddha were defined as male humans idealized in terms of particular cultural ideas. Magic became a suppressed activity because the priests of the new religions were not very adept at it, and they were not prepared to risk anyone else usurping their limited abilities. Because of an idealized conception of the unitary gods, all that was non-ideal or evil became lumped together in the form of various devil images. The horned god of antiquity reappeared as the anti-god of these systems. His devotees met secretly as witches and sorcerers to practice their magic. In the atheistic eon, through which the leading earthly cultures are now passing, God became man, stripped of his psychic and mystic capacities, but provided with physical technology instead. By a supreme act of selective inattention, atheistic cultures managed to not observe the manifestation of any order of reality beyond the physical. The life force of the cosmos and the beings within it elude their equations and become the hidden God. In the Taoist eon, on whose threshold we stand, a new conception of psychic reality is forming. This new conception is growing on a number of fronts. The leading edge of quantum physics seems to be providing a theoretical basis for many of the phenomena rediscovered by the renaissance of interest in parapsychology and ancient magical practice. In this new paradigm, the animating force of the entire vast universe can be called chaos. It is the inexpressible pregnant void from which manifest existence, order, and form arise. Being omnipresent and non-dualistic, it is virtually imperceptible, inconceivable, and impossible to visualize. Almost any attempt to say anything about it would be a denial of its other qualities, and so a lie. We could say it was chaotic or random, for form arises from it without cause. We could describe it as fortuitously random, but that would only reflect our positive attitude to existence if we take the trouble to maintain one. We could say that it operates at the quantum subatomic level and within the core of our being, if only because we are unable to detect more than its secondary effects elsewhere. We could say that its most obvious manifestation is change. This rather effective definition is actually based on a trick or an approximation. Nothing we can know is actually static or unchanging. We would be completely unable to perceive something that was totally motionless, for it would not emit energy nor impede the flow of objects through it. Chaos might be better visualized as the only point at rest, the unmoved mover, as it were. However we choose to see it, the ultimate ground of being is utterly void to our understanding, impersonal and inhuman, whimsical and capricious, and far too infinite and incomprehensible to be much use as a god to limited dualistic beings like ourselves. There is a part of chaos which is of more direct relevance to the magician. This is the spirit of the life energy of our planet. All living beings have some extra quality in them which separates them from inorganic matter. The ancient shamans mainly sought to represent this force by the horned god. In more modern times, this force has reasserted itself in our awareness under the symbol of Baphomet. Baphomet is the psychic field generated by the totality of living beings on this planet. Since the shamanic eon, it has been variously represented as Pan, Pangenitor, Pamphage, All-Begetter, All-Destroyer as Shiva Kali, Creative Phallus and Abominable Mother and Destroyer as Abraxas, Polymorphic God who is both good and evil as the animal-headed devil of sex and death, as the evil Archon set over this world, as Ishtar or Astaroth, goddess of love and war, as the Anima Mundi, or world soul, or simply as goddess. Other representations include the eagle, or Baron Samedi, or Thanateros, or Carnunos, the horned god of the Celts. The appellation Baphomet is obscure, but probably arises from the Greek Baphometus, union with wisdom. Gods with Baphometic names and images reoccur throughout Gnostic teachings. No image can fully represent the totality of what this force is, but it is conventionally shown as a hermaphrodite goddess in the form of a horned human that includes various mammalian and reptilian characteristics. It should also resume protozoan, insectivorous, and floral symbolism, for it is the animating spirit of everything, from a bacterium to a tiger. If we succeeded in creating machine consciousness, it will have to include mechanical elements as well. Between its horns, a torch is usually positioned, for spirit is most easily visualized as light. The image should also include necrotic elements, for it also encompasses death. Life and death are a single phenomenon through which the life force continually reincarnates. A denial of death is also a denial of life. The cellular mechanisms which allow life also make death inevitable, essential, and desirable. All religions which deny death are basically anti-life. Have no fear. You have been, and will be, millions of things. All you will suffer is amnesia. The sexual aspects of the god-goddess Baphomet are always emphasized, for sex creates life, and the sexuality is a measure of the life force or vitality, no matter how it is expressed. The spirit of the life force is the spirit of the dual ecstasy, procreation and reabsorption, sex and death. Beautiful and terrible god of the hovering hawk, god of the thrusting sapling, god of conjoined lovers, god of the worm-filled carcass, god of the starting hare, god of the wild hunt carousing the forest in mad exhilaration. Invoke this god with wild, uninhibited love play, and with wine and strange drugs which thrill and exalt the vitality and imagination. Lastly, draw thine own exhilarated consciousness into communion with this god by profound concentration and visualization, and the magic life force is thine to wield for good or ill. O come forth in horned majesty as the power of the air, and grant us the power of the wind sight and the wind speech. Virtually all mythologies retain some lore about primitive reptilian energies, which often antedate the gods themselves. Thus, in many cosmologies, we have various Leviathan-like serpents encircling the universe, or Tiamat-type chaotic dragons from which existence springs. The gods are frequently depicted as having slain or imprisoned these reptilian forces, or as being perpetually engaged in suppressing them. Virtually, all demons are depicted as part animal, and the majority have some reptilian features. A number of ingenious but incorrect suggestions have been put forward to account for the ubiquitous representation of primal or evil forces with reptilian symbols. It is true that serpents resemble the phallus, but the majority of quadrupedal reptiles do not. It is also true that some snakes give the appearance of regenerating themselves when they shed their skin, but even casual observation would quickly show that this does not make snakes immortal. Some large reptiles are undoubtedly dangerous to health, but the terrifying dinosaurs were already long extinct before man appeared. If we do retain ancestral memories of fighting fearsome animals, then those animals would have been almost entirely mammals: mammoth, bears, oryx, and great cats. No, there must be some more profound connection between man and the dragon to explain the universal occurrence of this cultural myth, even in lands with few spectacular reptiles. The dragon of our mythologies sleeps inside our own heads. Evolution has left us with 3 brains. Instead of a complete restructuring of the brain at each phase of evolutionary advance, new bits were simply added on to cover the new functions. The newest part of our brain is what makes us uniquely human. Only the apes show anything similar. The next oldest part is something we share with the mammals generally. The most primitive part of the brain is something that the mammals, including ourselves, share with the reptiles. The human has a man, a wolf, and a crocodile living inside of his skull. All the dragons, serpents, and scaly demons of myth and nightmare are reptile atavisms arising out of the older parts of our brains. Evolution has not deleted these ancestral behavior patterns, merely buried them under a pile of new modifications. Thus, in mythology, the gods, as a representatives of human consciousness, suppress the titans and dragons of the older consciousness. The traditions of magic preserve a number of techniques for arousing the sleeping dragons and wolves of the older brains. If the body's etheric forces are directed upwards into the cranium, the first parts of the brain to be activated will be the reptilian circuits. Thus, in Oriental esotericism, liberating the serpent power is called raising the kundalini. Mindful of the dangers in this technique, the Oriental magicians insisted that the kundalini must not be allowed to linger here, but must be made to enter the higher cerebral centers. The older brain centers can also be activated during intense states of excitement or meditative quiescence. Gnosis can be directed to these levels by visualizing oneself in the required beast form, and by using sigils to reach the subconscious behavior programs. The dragon mind finds magical application in the creation of powerful and rather nasty demons and for the projection of enchantments of a similar nature. The programs of the reptilian consciousness do not extend to compassion or conscience and contain only enough forethought for the necessities of hunting, killing, eating, and reproducing. Society and religions have been concerned with keeping the dragon and wolf permanently suppressed except at such times as it suited them to make war. For the magician, these atavistic forces are a source of personal power. Thus, Baphomet, the magician's god, is frequently shown in composite man, mammal, serpent form, as are many shamanic gods. The psychic censor. The physical part of ourselves is very touchy about chaos and magic. In fact, our mind abhors these things, and there is a very powerful censor mechanism that prevents us from using or noticing all but a small fraction of it. When people are presented with real magical events, they somehow manage not to notice. If they are forced to notice something uncontrovertibly magical, they may become terrified, nauseated, and ill. The psychic censor shields us from intrusions from other realities. It edits out most telepathic communication, blinds us to prescience, and reduces our ability to register significant coincidences or recall dreams. The psychic censor is not just put there out of divine malice. Ordinary physical life would be impossible without it. It would be like living permanently under the influence of hallucinogens. The consciousness force in us that appears as the root of will and perception can be called the Kia. This Kia has no form. Any form of innate or divinely sanctioned motive that one may seem to have found in it is an illusion. It is this void at the center of one's being which is the real holy guardian angel. The psychic censor, on the other hand, is a material thing which protects the mind from magic and from being overwhelmed by the awesome strangeness of the psychic dimension, which appears to us as chaos. Magicians have a number of tricks up their sleeves for selectively bypassing the psychic censor. The censor is more active on some levels of consciousness than others. On the dream level, the perception, and sometimes the will, has more freedom to act magically, but the censor will often succeed in preventing either the command to do this from penetrating the dream level or prevent the memory of it being available on the awareness level. The awareness level, on which we are conscious of thinking and being emotional, is given the greatest degree of protection by the censor, and many magical techniques are designed to draw consciousness away from this level. The robotic level on which we perform automatic tasks is less well protected. In a state of absent-minded preoccupation, strange flashes of almost subliminal perception may occur, but the censor often acts to prevent these from fully entering awareness. If this barrier can be overcome, an almost maddening volume of telepathy, short-term precognition, and improbable coincidence can be perceived. The Gnostic level of quiescent concentration or ecstatic excitement is the least protected by the censor, because in this level much of the mind is silenced. Consequently, most effective magical systems have developed one or more methods of entering this level deliberately. The Demon Karanzan. A curious error has entered into many systems of occult thought. This is the notion of some higher self or true will which has been misappropriated from the monotheistic religions. There are many who like to think that they have some inner self which is somehow more real or spiritual than their ordinary or lower self. The facts do not bear this out. There is no part of one's beliefs about oneself which cannot be modified by sufficiently powerful psychological techniques. There is nothing about oneself which cannot be taken away or changed. The proper stimuli can, if correctly applied, turn communists into fascists, saints into devils, the meek into heroes, and vice versa. There is no sovereign sanctuary within ourselves which represents our real nature. There is nobody at home in the internal fortress. Everything we cherish as our ego, everything we believe in, is just what we have cobbled together out of the accident of our birth and subsequent experiences. With drugs, brainwashing, and other techniques of extreme persuasion, we can quite readily make a man a devotee of a different ideology, the patriot of a different country, or the follower of a different religion. Our mind is just an extension of the body, and there is no part of it which cannot be taken away or modified. The only part of ourselves which exists above the temporary, immutable psychological structure we call the ego is the kya. Kya is the deliberately meaningless term given to the vital spark of our life force within us. The kya is without form. It is neither this nor that. There is almost nothing we can say of it except that it is the void center of consciousness, and it is what it touches. It does not have any qualities like goodness, compassion, or spirituality, nor their opposites. It does, however, give a feeling of meaning or consciousness when we experience or will anything, and it becomes more apparent to us when we experience something powerfully. Laughter and ecstasy gives us a glimpse of it. The center of consciousness is formless and without qualities of which mind can form images. There is no one at home. Kya is anonymous. We are an incomprehensible biomystic force field, from hyperspace if you like, with the mind and body attached. The mistake of so many occult systems is to imagine that the Kya has some preordained or intrinsic quality or nature. This is just a wishful thinking, trying to give cosmic significance to the ego. Our ego is what the mind thinks we are. It is an image of ourselves which grows out of our life experiences. Our body, sex, race, religion, culture, education, socialization, fears, and desires. There is a great pressure on us to develop an integrated and assertive ego. We are supposed to know exactly who we are and what we believe, and are supposed to be able to defend that identity. The more strongly we identify with something, the more strongly must we reject its opposite. Thus, the strongest, most obsessive egos belong to the least complete beings. For these types, there is the additional problem that to exalt any principle will eventually attract its opposite. Those who exalt strength will be drawn into a position of weakness. Those who strive for good will become embroiled in evil. Developing an ego is like building a castle against reality. It provides some defense and a sense of purpose, but the larger it is, the more it invites attack, and, ultimately, it must crumble. There is a further problem. All fortresses are also prisons. Because our beliefs imply a rejection of their opposites, they severely restrict our freedom. Most mystics and religiously oriented magicians describe their mystical experiences in terms of transcendence. They describe themselves as having been swept up into something far greater, as a leaf in a hurricane, or as a teardrop slipping into an ocean. They claim that their own ego has been obliterated and merged into union with the Godhead. Nothing of the sort has occurred. They have merely employed some form of Gnostic exaltation to inflate their own ego into an immense version of God that they have been carefully cultivating. The process differs not one whit from that employed by the black magician, who also inflates his ego to cosmic dimensions, save that the religious types need a god in whose name to advance their own interests. They may also make a passing show of humility to conceal from themselves the enormity of their megalomania. Exactly the same thing happens when a magician attempts to invoke his holy guardian angel. The source of consciousness exists as the powers of will and perception. Any names, images, symbols, and directives that the magician receives will only be exaggerated artifacts from his own mind and ego, and possibly telepathic fragments from other people. Because he obtains these communications in a Gnostic state, he is likely to accept them uncritically. Gnosis also unleashes subconscious creativity, and the messages are likely to be even more alluring if they are strung together with unexpected cleverness. We, each of us, have a real holy guardian angel, or Kya, which is our power of consciousness, magic, and genius. We also have a regrettable capacity to become obsessed with the mere products of our genius, mistaking them for the genius itself. These obsessional side effects have a genetic name, Kuranzan, or perhaps the demon's Kuranzan, for its name is multiple. To worship these creations is to imprison oneself in madness and to invoke eventual disaster. Belief in a god or belief in one's ego are the same thing. Every man is already his own diseased vision of God. Both the religious maniac and the black magician acquire a certain charisma and mission from their respective obsessions, but ultimately their quest is futile, for they cannot get beyond their own inflated fears and desires to the real thing, the anonymous and formless yet fantastic power source within themselves. That we are conscious, magical, and creative is the most mysterious and incredible thing in the universe. Any god or higher self we can imagine is necessarily less amazing than what we ourselves actually are, for it is merely one of our own creations. Myself, I am unwilling to give any sensible man, attribute, or glyph to the infinite mystery within the core of my consciousness and behind the illusion of the universe. It has been wisely said that the absolute is either ineffable or it is less than us. To invoke the real holy guardian angel, or Kia, is a paradoxically difficult task. As it has no form, there is no way to get an imaginative grip on it. It cannot be willed or perceived, for it is itself the root of will and perception. If one invokes the holy guardian angel with the general expectation of various signs and manifestations, then one's genius and magical capacities will usually provide these if enough gnosis is employed. Alternatively, if one enters an exalted state in an unplanned way, then the free belief generated will usually attach itself to any incipient mystical ideals one may have. In both cases, one has missed the boat. Let me repeat my startlingly simple message. The real holy guardian angel is just the force of consciousness, magic, and genius itself, nothing more. This cannot manifest in a vacuum. It is always expressed in some form, but its expressions are not the thing itself. There are perhaps only two things one can do to invoke the real HGA or Kia. Firstly, the ego can be put in its place by deliberately seeking union with anything one has rejected. Secondly, the hidden god force Kia can be felt as the root of all acts of consciousness, magic, and genius by performing as diverse and extensive a series of these acts as possible. Invoke often, as the oracle said, and banish Karanzan whenever it manifests. Shamanism. Shamanism is our oldest magical and mystical tradition. It is from shamanism that all religious arts and magical sciences originate. The shamanic traditions are still practiced on all the southern continents, Australia, Africa, and South America. It is primarily found in hunting societies, but survives also in semi-settled village life, where it takes on more of the character of witch doctoring. The encroachments of modern civilization have almost destroyed shamanism in North America, Oceania, Northern Asia, and within the Arctic Circle. Some shamanic knowledge survived in European witchcraft, while in the Middle East, shamanism became swallowed up in the priestly cults of classical civilizations. Two conclusions can be drawn from an examination of remaining shamanic cultures, and from records of those now extinct. Firstly, despite the enormous geographical separation between shamanic cultures, they share almost identical methods. Secondly, it is shamanic knowledge and power that contemporary magicians seek to rediscover. The basic principles of magic, like the basic principles of science, do not change, but they can become lost. Shamanism presents a very full magical technology which resumes all occult themes. Mankind now stands in greater need of these abilities than at any time since the first eon, if he is to understand rather than destroy himself. Shamanism once guided all human societies and kept them in equilibrium with their environment for thousands of years. All occultism is an attempt to win back that awesome lost wisdom. Let us look, then, at what the traditions of shamanism hold. Shamanic power cannot be progressively accumulated like other technology. A shaman will be lucky if his own apprentices make any advance beyond his own achievements. Shamanic powers are so difficult to master that a tradition requires a continual influx of talent just to prevent itself from degenerating. For this reason, shamans usually describe their tradition as having declined from past glories. Only an occasional exceptional practitioner can win back some of the more legendary powers. Central to shamanism is the perception of an otherworld or series of otherworlds. This type of astral or etheric dimension containing various powers, entities, and forces allows real effects to be created in this world. The shaman's soul journeys through this dimension while in ecstatic or drug-induced state of trance. The journey may be undertaken for divinatory knowledge, to cure sickness, to deliver a blow to enemies, or to find game animals. Prospective shamans are usually selected from those with a nervous disposition. They may either be assigned to shamanic instruction or are driven to it by a power present in the shamanic culture. Initiation invokes a journey into the other world, a meeting with spirits, and a death-rebirth experience. In the death-rebirth experience, the candidate has a vision of his body being dismembered, often by fantastic beings or animal spirits, and then reassembled from the wreckage. The new body invariably contains an extra part often described as an additional bone or an inclusion of magical quartz stones or sometimes an animal spirit. This experience graphically symbolizes the location of the etheric force field within the body or the addition of various extra powers to it. In most shamanic systems, with etheric force is exuded through the navel region for short-range magics, although it can be sent through the eyes or hands instead. It is the same as the chi or ki or kundalini or aura. The shamanic tradition exhibits a full range of magical themes. Exorcism and curing are the main skills shared with the community, and these are usually undertaken in trance and ecstatic states, during which an otherworld journey is made to seek a cure. Magical attack and protection may be performed for clients, and shamans themselves will frequently fight each other for supremacy, often assuming their otherworld animal shapes for this purpose. Some shamanists cultivate enormous physiological control with which to resist extremes of heat, cold, and pain. Firewalking, in which fierce heat is magically prevented from scorching flesh, is a very common feature of this tradition and occurs worldwide. Congress with the spirit world is extensive and includes various nature spirits, animal and plant entities and servitors, the shades of the dead, sexual entities like incubi and succubi, and usually a horned god, even in lands with no horned animals. Egress into the otherworld is made through perilous clashing gates, comparable to the modern conception of the abyss. Dream as well as trance is an important method of obtaining access to the other world. Shamanic tools are highly varied, but usually include a noise-making device, such as a drum or snake bone rattle, to call spirits and induce trance, as well as various power objects, most commonly quartz crystal. The extraordinary traditions of shamanism are the fountainhead of all occult systems, and it is to shamanism that we must look if we wish to pick up the pieces of magic, man's oldest science, and use them again. Gnosticism. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, a series of bizarre cults sprang up in various parts of the Roman Empire, notably in Alexandria, that melting pot of peoples and cultures at the mouth of the Nile. These cults were known as Gnostic. Their ideas and activities seem oddly to be both antique and highly advanced. When the Black Order of hierarchical Christianity rose to ascendancy, it vigorously and violently suppressed these cults. However, you cannot blame Jesus for the religion practiced in his name. The Gnostics left a wealth of written material, and some of their cults survived underground to influence the development of the magic art in later centuries. The medieval Cathars and Albigensians certainly possessed some Gnostic knowledge, and this chapter will suggest that their influence can be detected at many other points. There are many threads in Gnostic thought. It contains cosmic speculations, elevated enough to compare with the most refined of the Eastern systems. Some of these speculations anticipate medieval Kabbalah and astrology. There is a well-developed system of magic surviving mostly in the form of artifacts. The Gnostics had a variety of ethical systems based either on complete archaic libertinism or else on strict asceticism, whichever seemed most likely to lead to liberation in any particular situation. Above all, Gnosticism was concerned with mystical experience, gnosis, as opposed to mere pistis or faith. What the world has tended to remember the Gnostics for, however, is their apocryphal stories, which mock the orthodox religions of their times. Gnosticism has been supremely important in the development of Western occultism, for it represents a synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Oriental enlightenments, which were swiftly forced underground and later appeared in the works of medieval and Renaissance magicians, in the Templars, in witchcraft, in Rosicrucianism, and in our own time. To the Gnostics, no conception of God or the ultimate or whatever was infinite enough. They considered that the Supreme Being was completely ineffable and beyond anything that could be said of it. They laughed at the hopelessly parochial, anthropomorphic conceptions of the Absolute that other religions put forward, and endeavored to say as little about it as possible, save that it was too immense to have ideas about. To them it was like the Tao or the void. They did, however, consider that there was a small fragment of this infinitude in man and in every living being. Gnosis meant experiencing this primal spark within oneself. Exactly how the infinite fragmented itself and descended into existence with matter was the subject of unending debate amongst the Gnostics. They produced many theories. Some were merely poetic allegories of the process in sexual terms. Some were allegorical commentaries on human psychology. Every cosmology embodies a psychology. Some were excuses to heap ridicule on other religions. Some were probably deliberate attempts to ridicule the idea of understanding the process with the mind at all. In constructing these theories, they produced a varied and colorful intermediate magical world of various eons and archons between this world and the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality gave rise to a number of eons, usually 30, which surround the material universe. These eons are not so much periods of time as spiritual principles or principalities. This idea seems to have reappeared in the magical visions of Dr. John Dee, who saw them as 30 ethers. Various tensions inherent in the eons resulted in the formation of a number of archons, or rulers. In other systems, the ultimate reality itself is the first archon, and from this a number of subsequent archons, usually 7, the hebdomad, evolved by a process of enoia, or what we might call thought projection. The enoia of the first archon produced a being, Barbalo, or Barbalon, having a female or androgynous nature. Alternatively, Barbalo might be identified with the Great Silence in which the prime cause or first archon manifested. Somehow, from these cosmic principles, the force responsible for the creation of this world arose. This is variously called Ayaldaboth, or Sabaoth, or Iao, and many other names. Sometimes the force is sevenfold and identified with the astrological planets. This force is conceived of as androgynous, or male with an animal-headed manifestation. It is held responsible for the creation of material beings into which the ultimate reality then condescended to breathe a vital spark. Barbalo is known to us as Babylon, or Nuit, the great star mother, in whom one must seek reabsorption to penetrate the highest mystery. Yaldabaoth was yet another manifestation of the ubiquitous horned god known to the Templars as Baphomet, and Christians as the devil. The dragon force appears in some Gnostic systems as the world serpent or leviathan encircling the universe and biting its own tail. The Gnostics' attitudes to the material life, although apparently contradictory, are a direct consequence of their gnosis and their cosmological speculations. Having experienced the spark of the infinite within, they realized they could not be touched by anything, and thus they were free to do anything at all. Some considered particular forms of activity more likely to obscure the vital spark, and other forms more likely to liberate it. Some were libertines, some ascetics. They usually chose to be the opposite of prevailing social customs. The material world was considered to be entirely evil, corrupt, and imperfect. This was chiefly because of its obvious impermanence. Only the vital spark was immortal and would reincarnate until it achieved union with the infinite, either at the end of the universe or by liberating itself in the meantime. This then, briefly, was the Gnostic view of reality. Gnosticism was never an organized religion, but existed as a series of elitist cults led by such notables as the wizard Simon Magus, the philosopher Valentinius, and Apollonius of Tyana. Each teacher spread his gnosis by word of mouth. couching the message in a form suited to the local belief structure, adapting Gnostic practices to local need. In addition, a great deal was written down, partly to remind particular teachers what they had taught and also to sow confusion and dissent in the ranks of the main organized religions of today, Christianity and Judaism. A number of alternative bits of the Bible were produced to put across some important Gnostic speculations. Firstly, the God Yahweh of the Old Testament was seen as a vicious, senile old fool intent on persecuting humanity, while the serpent, who gave knowledge, was seen as humanity's friend. Secondly, Jesus was seen as a true messenger of the infinite, but his crucifixion was considered meaningless. Only his message of love and the power above were thought important. The Gnostics were true anarchists of the spirit. They saw all other religions as encouraging enslavement to priesthoods and secular powers with their legal and moral structures. Against these things, they ranged their cosmological jokes, their anti-morality, and their magic. Gnostic magic included the use of familiar spirits, the necromancy, and the use of potions for erotic and dream-inducing purposes, but their main practices were orgiastic, talismanic, and incantatory. Their orgiastic rites included the consumption as sacraments of the mixed male and female sexual elixirs and menstrual blood after coitus. They were also reputed to have consumed their own deliberately aborted fetuses. Most Gnostic sects were not interested in reproduction, which they considered to be a repetition of a fundamental error. Their sexual rites were designed to cheat the evil archon of further human victims, and to give an inspirational foretaste of the final and ultimate reabsorption into Babylon. The Gnostics left behind them innumerable intricate and beautiful impressions on stone, jewels, ceramic, and metal which go under the name of Gnostic gems. These would have functioned as talismans and amulets charged with various spells and enchantments. They have also left us some very striking and bizarre votive statuary which would have functioned as fetishistic centerpieces in rituals. Many of the words of power and barbarous names of evocation that exist in medieval and contemporary magic have their origin in Gnostic incantations. These are often woven into invocations of great beauty and power, such as the Bornless or Headless ritual. The word abracadabra itself comes from the name of the Gnostic god Abraxas. A number of Gnostic sects were active around the Damascus area, and if one were trying to rediscover or even invent the dread Necronomicon of the Lovecraft mythos, then Gnosticism would be the best source. The timeless themes of magic appear in their completeness in Gnosticism because it was able to draw its techniques from Egyptian learning, from the Greek mystery schools, and from systems further east, each of which had preserved traditions from that ultimate wellspring of magic, shamanism. Occult priestcraft. Magical, mystical, and religious enterprises seek to fulfill 5 basic human needs, which can be identified as follows: to provide techniques of emotional engineering, to give life a sense of meaning, to provide some means of intercession or intervention, to supply an explanation of death, to formulate a social structure or cult. These needs are deeply interrelated, and many religions, and particularly many political philosophies, do not attempt to deal with them all. Finding a solution to some of the problems may make it less urgent to solve others. An occult priest should be capable of dealing with all of these issues. Let us consider how he might tackle each one and contrast his methods with those of the more orthodox systems. Emotional engineering. This includes all practices designed to stimulate or control emotional states: exaltation in prayer and song, contrition and guilt for imagined sins, fear and anguish at the specter of divine anger, and joy at the prospect of divine reward. In our culture, a correlation between a fall-off in religion and an increase in the use of mood-altering drugs is very marked. The greatest threat to religion, however, is entertainment. The new power of the entertainment media to supply us with everything from joy to terror has usurped many of the functions of the priest. There is a refreshing honesty about secular entertainment. It's just entertainment without the excuse of spirituality for its justification. It is still, however, manipulative. If the magician wishes to put himself into or out of any emotional state, then he should be provided with the techniques to accomplish this. The process requires no justification. That he wills it is sufficient. One cannot escape emotional experience in a human incarnation, and it is preferable to adopt a master rather than a slave relationship to it. The occult priest should be capable of instructing anyone in the procedures of emotional engineering. The main methods are the Gnostic ones of casting oneself into a frenzied ecstasy, stilling the mind to a point of absolute quiescence, and evoking the laughter of the gods by combining laughter with the contemplation of paradox. Anyone who masters these techniques fully has achieved a tremendous power over himself, more valuable than health, love, fame, or riches. He has set himself free from the effects of the world. Nothing can touch him unless he wills it. As it has been said, the sage who knows how can live comfortably in hell. Meaning. Meaning is motivation. Anything which gives rise to physical and mental behavior of any kind is providing meaning. Thus the body is the source of many basic meanings in this world. Pain, pleasure, hunger, sexuality, and so on provide an impetus to action and hence a source of meaning. Once the organism has solved these problems, other more subtle motivations arise on the mental level. Desire for knowledge and power, and emotional gratification of all kinds. Beyond this, the organism may seek higher level motivations, which have been called spiritual, and some there are who seek the meaning of meaning itself. To question any level of meaning with reason is usually to lose it. Meaning arises from the differentiation of experience into pain and pleasure, good and evil, interesting and uninteresting, beautiful and ugly, worthwhile and not worthwhile. Experiences are only meaningful when we are sensitive to them. We can only perceive difference. Ideas are only meaningful when we can appreciate their separateness and novelty. Spirituality only arises when we begin to consider some things non-spiritual. Meaning is dependent on establishing dualities, and belief is fundamentally an act of differentiation, considering one thing different from another. So ideas which create meaning for us must be conditional beliefs. For example, certain knowledge about God, whether it was yes or no, or certainty about everlasting life, either yes or no, would completely destroy any meaning in these ideas. If this were absolutely believed to be everlasting heaven or hell, with no escape, there would be no reason to care about anything. Reason is therefore destructive of meaning when it seeks unconditional and absolute answers. In this context, it is probably more prudent to stay the hand of suicide and ask if reason is not somewhat out of phase with the nature of existence. The ascetic, mystic, and the magician adopt different stances towards their respective existences. The ascetic mystic conceives a vast differentiation between the material and the spiritual. He then attempts to withdraw meaning from the material so that he can put into the spiritual. Withdrawing meaning from the material seems a bizarre exercise, but there is an inner logic to it. He seeks indifference to sex, indifference to hunger, to pleasure, and to pain, indeed to everything that motivates normal men. In return, a whole world of what he calls spiritual experiences opens up for him. His dreams, his acts of devotion, and his inner thoughts become charged with meaning. For those who devise or believe in religions, it is necessary to erect conceptions on a cosmic scale to provide a source of reference and meaning. Invariably, the highest principle must be paradoxical or contain some duality. Either the ultimate principle must actually consist of two opposed principles, or there must be some sort of fall from the ultimate. The paradoxes of religion are unquestionable and can only be interpreted on a hierarchical basis. Religions are innately repressive and conservative. Only heresy and schism permit any evolution of ideas. Much of the meaning in religion derives from authority and obedience, relationships. Hence, religions exist only as social phenomena. Private religion inevitably evolves into mysticism or magic, and these have a tendency to devolve into new religions. The magician does not conceive of such a vast gulf between spirit and matter. To him they are both part of the same thing, and he exalts neither above the other. He rejects no part of his experience. The magician lives in a continuum beginning with the sublime and ineffable Tao, God, chaos, through the mysterious and subtle ethers, to the awesome and strange material world. To the magician, any piece of knowledge, any new power, any opportunity for enlightenment is worth having for its own sake. The only thing abhorred in this incredible existence is failure to come to grips with some part of it. To be able to operate in all spheres, the magician must master the art of either acting without belief or being able to invest belief temporarily in anything with which he is experimenting. The magician should be equally at home with a crozier, a paintbrush, a test tube, or a wand. In all things, he is seeking to bring his Kia into manifestation. For him, life is its own answer, and the way he lives, it is his spirituality. It is senseless to ask grand and unspecific questions about life and the universe in general, because for an answer we can only invent hypothetical states of not life or not universe. The universe as it exists is a fantastic and magical place itself, and life is a mystery whose depth can never be exhausted. It is only when man does not pay enough attention to the totality of what is going on around him every second that he is tempted to invent spurious theories to cover his lack of knowledge. For the magician, that lack of knowledge is the ultimate source of meaning. The true priest is one who can communicate this sense of mystery. Intercession. All religions have some method of affecting reality, or of encouraging some god to affect reality, or of merely giving the appearance that they are doing these things. As a religion becomes more institutionalized and orthodox, there is less and less emphasis on this type of activity, and for good reason. Magic is a very anarchic business. Some people have a greater gift for it than others, and sometimes it fails. Most priests who become adept at it would soon realize it was their own psychic power at work and not that of a god. Such priests who become adept would soon attract a huge following and usurp and disorder the clerical hierarchy. All orthodoxies tend to frown on its use for this reason, and also because they might not themselves be able to deliver on demand. The religion's answer is to involve the congregation in a half-hearted attempt at intercession, and then be ready with the catchphrase, "It was not God's will," in the event of failure. One might well ask if God is going to do his will anyway. Surely he does not require a cue from us. The approach of the occult priest is entirely different when he leads his order or coven in magical activity. There is a high probability of failure because they may not be able to raise sufficient power, and they may not be doing exactly what is required. Everyone will be aware of this. In this situation they have to act with total commitment, and without the slightest trace of lust of result. Everything possible must be done on the physical plane to set up the conditions of success beforehand, and then the magic is hurled in to tip the balance. To have given one's utmost is enough in itself. The result can be awaited without fear or desire, and received with laughter, whatever it may be. Death. The difference between ideas and belief is that ideas may be true, but beliefs are always false. That may seem a monstrous thing to say, but I offer it as a definition. What separates an idea from a belief is the emotional force committed to upholding the belief. If something were really true for us, we would not have to make an effort to believe it. All beliefs about death have one other characteristic apart from their inherent improbability and falsity. They have to be conditional. That is to say, they have to contain both heaven and hell, or both pleasant and unpleasant reincarnations. Consider a scheme in which one was destined for either everlasting heaven or everlasting hell, or for either total extinction or perpetual existence as a totally disembodied spirit without the organs of will or sense. Or consider a certain knowledge that one's next incarnation could not be affected by events in this life. As beliefs, these things would be quite useless and unsatisfying. This reveals beliefs about death for what they mostly are, devices to create emotional effects in this life. The occult priest should abstain from adding anything to the necrotic heap. Rather, he should devote his talents to showing people what death is like. Necromancy is something of a dying art these days, largely because it has been widely abused by those who are merely telepathic with the living and or who want their money. Nevertheless, those who have directly seen or spoken to the dead have a certainty of something beyond faith. The single experience of having left one's body for a time is worth more than any belief, and it is the only useful preparation for death. The experience is reasonably accessible to any determined person. Social structure. Any human enterprise involving more than one individual will exhibit some form of social structure, from complete hierarchy to apparent democracy. The dynamics of assorted cults, cabals, and religions are instructive of the various ways in which magical orders ought and ought not to be organized. In a religion, hierarchy is of paramount importance and is effectively an object of worship itself, though this would never be openly stated. To enslave their followers, hierarchs represent themselves as the emissaries of higher powers, or the teaching, or whatever, but not as the thing itself. This is analogous to troops saluting not the officer but the commission he wears on his breast. The end result is the same, but it does help to overcome the ego resistance involved in one person submitting to the will of another. Once such an asymmetric relationship has been established, it readily perpetuates itself. The priest or leader is permitted to pass personal comments on his followers. These do not even need to be especially perceptive. They need only be the sort of things one's friends wouldn't say to one's face, plus a few things one would like to hear, and suddenly the guru appears the wisest man on earth. Another gambit of religious and political organizations is to force a re-rationalization of beliefs through action. People are not persuaded into belief intellectually. They are persuaded to perform religious acts in childhood or while under stress. Afterward, they develop or accept the rationalizations and opinions that go with it. To convert a man to anarchism, persuade him to throw a bomb for various romantic emotional reasons. He will subsequently have to adjust his beliefs to justify what he has done. The most successful organizations are those that plunge potential converts straight into action. Obedience follows a similar pattern. At first, only the smallest and most inconsequential obediences will be demanded. These force the rationalization that one is in fact loyal to whatever one is giving one's obedience to. This loyalty is but a stepping stone to greater acts of submission, usually of one's intelligence, wallet, and sexual favors. Leader-follower relationships also allow the leader to license his followers to act without responsibility. The natural inhibitions to displays of violence, sexuality, and other emotionalities can easily be overridden if the leader tells his followers to do these things. They will often thank him for letting them do what they have always had a desire to do. Secrecy and elitism characterize all hierarchies. There is nothing wrong with being elite or having real secrets as such, but most cults rely heavily on artificial elites and manufacture secrecy as a means of enticement and control. Accepting that elites exist and keeping secrets are acts of obedience themselves. Membership within an elite and a degree of megalomania are among the licenses leaders can confer upon followers. To this end, most cults reinforce their collective identity with standards of dress and behavior and all manner of badges, insignia, and labels. These often assume as much importance as the actual activities of the cult. People are easily tricked into accepting membership in a large group as a substitute for enlarging themselves. The activities of cults would seem to presuppose a high degree of cynicism among their leaders. This is rarely so. Most have swallowed their own lies and deceptions totally, or else rationalized them in terms of an even higher cause. As a result, their burning obsession equips them with a certain charisma, which puts fire in their eyes and inflames their speech. And what is the end result of all this cultish activity? Commercialism or a police raid. A cult either manages to turn itself into a harmless institution, or it becomes progressively more extremist until the state decides to smash it. A genuine magical order will be engaged in a psychic guerrilla warfare against all black cults and religions, including materialist philosophies. In such a cult, every man is his own priest. Any member has the right to teach any other member anything he knows. No member has the right to claim any secret within the order beyond the secrets of his own identity if he wishes it. Unlike cults and religions, a genuine order will not admit people on a number for its own sake basis. Vitality can only be maintained by quality control at the intake. Whatever hierarchy arises within an order will be a reflection of demonstrable ability. Attempts to use the various tricks of the teacher enumerated in this section will be immediately spotted and ridiculed. There is only one justification for the existence of a genuine magical order: to enable individuals to take control of their own spirituality. And that is a very heroic and dangerous objective. Watch out for the police raid. Magical weapons. The 5 classes of magical weapons are divided according to their function rather than by the gross appearance they may manifest on the physical plane. All weapons are designed to have an effect on the physical, but the weapons themselves exist primarily on the etheric or astral level. The physical form of a magical weapon is no more than a convenient handle or anchor for its etheric form. The sword and pentacle are weapons of analysis and synthesis respectively. Upon the pentacle, etheric forms, images, and powers are assembled when the magical will and perception vitalize the imagination. The magician may create hundreds of pentacles in the course of his sorceries, yet there is a virtue in having a general-purpose weapon of this class, for its power increases with use, and it can be employed as an altar for the consecration of lesser pentacles. For many operations of an evocatory type, the pentacle is placed on the cup and the conjuration performed with the wand. The sword, or more usually the dagger, is the weapon of analysis or scission, or in the most simple sense, destruction. Through the sword, the magical will and perception vitalize the imagination of the undoing of things. The sword is the reservoir of the power which disintegrates etheric influences through which the material plane is affected. Both the sword and pentacle are etheric weapons, through which the higher order powers of will, perception, and imagination execute mental commands on the planes of middle nature. The wand and cup weapons are used to transmit the power of the life force, or Kia, directly into the etheric. The wand is the weapon of will, and the cup that of perception. These words are used to convey the indescribable processes which occur at the interface of consciousness and matter, rather than mere sense perception and motor action. All that can be said of these processes is that some events have the appearance of proceeding from the outside into us, and others appear to originate within us and proceed outward. The lesson of all higher ecstasies is that this difference is arbitrary and unreal. Here we are entering a realm where our logic structures are ill-equipped to follow, and only the powers of the lamp transcend the paradox. The cup can be regarded as an etheric receptacle for the magical perception. Of all the weapons, it is the one least likely to resemble the physical object whose name it bears, although actual cups of ink or blood are sometimes used. For some, the cup exists as a mirror, a shoe stone, a state of trance, a tarot pack, a mandala, a state of dreaming, or a feeling that just comes to them. These things often act as devices for preoccupying oneself with something else, so that magical perceptions can surface unhindered by discursive thought and imagination. Part of the power that is built up in them can be likened to self-fascination. The cup weapon acquires an auto-hypnotic quality and provides a doorway through which the perception has access to other realms. The wand weapon similarly appears in a profusion of forms, as an instrument to assist the projection of the magical will onto the etheric and material planes. It could be a general-purpose sigil, an amulet, a ring, an enchanting mantra, or even an act or gesture one performs. As with the pentacle, there is a virtue in having a small, portable, and permanent device of this class, for power accrues to it with use. As with the cup, the power of the wand is partly to fascinate the surface functions of the mind and channel the forces concealed in the depths. Like the sword, the wand is manipulated in such a way as to describe vividly to the will and subconscious what is required of them. The lamp weapon is only named as such because of the popular analogy of spirit with light. Chaos, the ultimate substrate of existence, and Kia, the personal life force, are equally likely to be felt as an awesome darkness or as both brilliance and voidness simultaneously. As a device to channel these forces to the mundane consciousness of the magician, there is no limit to the forms the lamp might take. It could be anything from an idea of God or the Tao to some primitive-looking fetish or symbol. The way of the magician is the manifestation of spirit within matter, and his primary technique is gnosis, the focusing of consciousness by physiological means. The magician's lamp should be something which aids his gnosis and receives the forces he generates. The lamp is the weapon of inspiration in the original sense of the word. It inspirits him. The magician should be capable of performing any ritual on the astral, that is to say, by the power of imagination alone, by strongly visualizing any of his weapons to the point where he actually hallucinates their presence. He draws both the etheric form of the weapon and the associated powers within himself into action. Such empty hand techniques are the mark of an adept. Magical paradigms. Every system of thought and understanding stems from a number of basic postulates about the universe and man's relationship to it. These ideas and assumptions go to make up the paradigm or dominant worldview through which a culture or an individual interacts with its universe. Eons are marked by the passage of various great metaphysical thought paradigms rather than by the passage of set periods of historical time. Within each great paradigm, there will be lesser paradigms which contribute to the whole. For example, in the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of Europe and America, the main paradigms are Protestant atheism, with its dependent paradigms of liberal humanistic individualism, and the work ethic and science with its independent paradigms of casuality and materialism. Other cultures have had, and still do have, completely different worldviews which it is difficult for an outsider to enter. The universe, being the accommodating creature that she is, will tend to provide confirmation of any paradigm one chooses to live in. We are, to an extent, in an observer-created universe, rather than just drifting into the magical worldview in a haphazard way. It is useful to consider the alternative paradigms in which we might intend to operate. As most of us already have our being within a scientific cultural paradigm, a modern magical view must encompass this also if it is to be effective in a technological civilization. 6 alternative magical paradigms appear below, and they are indeed strange mixture of sorcery and hyperscience. All of them seem a little crazy from our normal point of view, but our normal point of view also proves to be pretty strange on close inspection. All magical paradigms partake of some form of action at a distance, be it distance in space or time or both. Although we are unable to imagine how this can occur, we should not throw it out the window. Science can readily demonstrate both action at a distance with gravity and magnetism, and the distortion of space, time, in so-called ordinary reality. In magic, this is not called ordinary reality. In magic, this is called synchronicity. A mental event, perception, or an act of will occurs at the same time synchronously as an event in the material world. Science does not deny the possibility that pure information can be transmitted from place to place. Indeed, the quantum inseparability principle demands that it must be. Of course, this can always be excused as coincidence, but most magicians would be quite content with being able to arrange coincidences. The following 6 paradigms seek to explain the mechanisms at work. The cow etheric paradigm. The manifest universe is just a tiny island of comparative order, set in an infinite ocean of primal chaos or potentia. Moreover, that limitless chaos pervades every interstice of our island of order. This island of order was randomly spewed up out of chaos and will eventually be redissolved into it. Although this universe is a highly unlikely event, it was bound to occur eventually. We ourselves are the most highly ordered structure known on that island. Yet in the very center of our being is a spark of that same chaos which gives rise to the illusion of this universe. It is this spark of chaos that animates us and allows us to work magic. We cannot perceive chaos directly, for it simultaneously contains the opposite to anything we might think it is. We can, however, occasionally glimpse and make use of partially formed matter which has only a probabilistic and indeterminate existence. This stuff we can call the ethers. If it makes us feel any better, we can call this chaos, the Tao, or God, and imagine it to be benevolent and human-hearted. There are two schools of thought in magic. One considers the formative agent of the universe to be random and chaotic, and the other considers that it is a force of spiritual consciousness. As they have only themselves on which to base their speculations, they are basically saying that their own natures are either random and chaotic or spiritually conscious. Myself, I am inclined to the view that my spiritual consciousness is random and chaotic in an agreeable sort of way. Probability manipulation. This is a far more modest, far less cosmically pretentious version of the first paradigm. There is a point somewhere in the genesis of any event when its future reality is uncertain. The universe is not an automatic clockwork structure. There is a level of disorganization within which the universe itself does not know what it is about to do. The information is not predictable even in the events themselves. Bizarre as it may seem, there is even an accurate mathematical formulation of the limits of this disorganization, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Now, events in the mind certainly partake of a similar quality. They are unpredictable and arise seemingly without cause. It has been suspected even by scientists that there is a hidden variable which causes the event to materialize in one particular form from a number of possibilities. This hidden variable is suspected of being consciousness or information. Consciousness, then, could be controlling how the indeterminate events will actually materialize. Armed with this idea, and applying his magic to the critical point, the magician may engineer some impressive coincidences. Morphic field theory. The novel and extraordinary hypothesis of formative causation provides an excellent magical paradigm. Briefly, it states that whenever a new event occurs in the universe, it predisposes all subsequent similar events to occur in the same way by the agency of a morphic field, ubiquitously across space and time. The hypothesis does not concern itself with why the event occurred in the first place, but suggests that as soon as it has happened, it generates this morphic field which makes it more likely to occur again. This provides a rationale for much magic. Clairvoyance, for example, is the tapping of a morphic field left by an event in the distant or recent past. Only prophecy, always the most doubtful of the mantic arts, cannot be fitted into this scheme. Atavisms, entities, gods, and demons would represent the morphic field left by animals and human thoughts. Sympathetic magic becomes the deliberate representation of an event in a miniature to produce a morphic field, which causes the desired event to occur elsewhere. If imagining an event is enough to generate a small morphic field, then the effectiveness of visualization is explained. Religion takes the view that consciousness preceded organic life. Supposedly there were gods, angelic forces, titans, and demons setting the scene before material life developed. Science takes the opposite view and considers that much organic evolution occurred before the phenomenon of consciousness appeared. Magic, which has given more attention to the quality of consciousness itself, takes an alternative view and concludes that organic and psychic forms evolved synchronously. As organic development occurs, a psychic field is generated which feeds back into the organic forms. Thus, each species of living being has its own type of psychic form or magical essence. These egregores may occasionally be felt as a presence or even glimpsed in the form of the species they watch over. Those who have perceived the human egregore usually describe it as God. Communion with the morphic fields of beasts is of great importance to the shaman and sorcerer, as it conveys intimate knowledge about the actual creature and allows the
magician a certain power over the species. It may also allow him to appropriate certain of the beast's powers, particularly on the etheric plane. This is the reason for the worldwide occurrence of totemism among hunting peoples and the prevalence of animal-headed human-bodied gods in most mythologies. Magicians consider that all life on this world contributes to and depends on a vast composite egregore, which has variously been known as the Great Mother, the Anima Mundi, the Great Archon, the Devil, Pan, and Baphomet. Observer-created universe. We usually tend to regard will and perception as separate functions of our consciousness or awareness. Indeed, our will and perception seem to be the most basic properties of our being. However, try making these assumptions. Everything we perceive is real, not unreasonable. Anything we cannot perceive does not exist, not for us anyway. Anything we will that does not come into our perception was not will but merely a failed wish. Then will and perception are the same thing. Glance around you for a moment. Your entire universe is exactly as you willed and perceived it. It is all a creation of your belief in it. Even other persons must be counted as figments of your belief in them. Obviously, the beliefs which uphold the universe must be pretty deep-seated and not amenable to mere wishes, although real acts of will perception might change parts of it. This provides a magical model in which everything is permitted, though it might be damnably difficult. Austin Spare often worked with this paradigm, anticipating by half a century the development of non-objectivity, one of a number of interpretations of quantum theory. This suggests that it is the actual act of willed perception or measurement which actually creates events. Magically, it is by tapping the deepest levels of consciousness and belief that creative events are initiated. The holographic universe. To specify the position of a particle with complete accuracy, we would have to also specify the relative position of each and every other particle in the universe. In the holographic universe model, this idea is taken one step further. Every particle in the universe is actually connected to every other particle by some hidden form of instantaneous connection. This connection has a mathematical formulation in the quantum inseparability principle. Hypotheses of this type are often called bootstrap theories, because they suggest that everything is the cause of everything. The universe is upholding itself by its own bootstraps. Any change anywhere in such a holographic universe would, in theory, be detachable everywhere instantly. Such a hidden form of instantaneous communication is the very stuff of magic. The web of connections between every event can be seen as a higher-order reality, the hologram. The part of reality of which we are normally aware is merely a projection of this, the holograph. Synchronicity and all other magical paradigms assume that there is some form of information transfer which can proceed in rather unusual ways across space and time. Although it is difficult to imagine how matter or energy can behave in this way, there is no reason why pure information itself cannot be made to do this. Pure information has no weight or force, and so nothing could prevent its instantaneous passage to anywhere, or perhaps any when. It is likely that somewhere within the psyche and within the quantum indeterminacy that underlies physical reality, there may be something acting as transmitter and receiver of this pure information. This would, for example, explain why psychic phenomena can be perceived but cannot easily be made to register objectively, as anyone who has tried to photograph or tape record ghosts will appreciate. It would also confirm the magical commonplace that it is easier to make a man fall under a 16-ton weight than to make a 16-ton weight fall upon a man. The information required is infinitely smaller in the first case, unless, of course, one can hex the crane driver at exactly the right moment. Higher dimensionality. We find ourselves in a universe that is at least four-dimensional. To be sensible to us, an event must have a displacement in both space and time. A piece of paper having only 2 or 3 dimensions, that is, having no thickness, or existing for an imperceptibly short time, could not be part of our universe. Although we commonly think in terms of a 3-dimensional reality, this must be at least a 4-dimensional reality, even if time does appear to have a different quality to our perception. We often forget to include time in our conceptions because we take simultaneity for granted. We assume that things exist in the same time frame and that they will persist. Suppose for a moment that there were a fifth dimension that we were unable to perceive with our senses. Suppose also that all phenomena were five-dimensional. How could five-dimensional phenomena appear to our four-dimensional perception? A point from the fifth dimension would not be perceivable in four dimensions. This may explain why fundamental particles or quarks cannot be observed singly. Higher dimensionality might also solve other problems in physics like parity violation and certain properties of the vacuum. A line from the fifth dimension would appear to us only as a point. A five-dimensional surface would appear as a line in our reality. A five-dimensional solid object would be perceived as a surface, and the things which appear to us as solid objects in our reality would be the manifestations of true five-dimensional solids for which we have no name. Now, points, lines, surfaces, and solid objects do not actually exist in this fifth dimension, any more than points, lines, and surfaces exist in ordinary four-dimensional geometry, except as idealizations. It therefore follows that if there were five dimensions, all the things we perceive as existing solid objects in our reality are merely the way that five-dimensional objects appear to us. This may seem a nonsensical complication, but it was raised to demonstrate that we might be living in a five-dimensional reality, yet be unable to perceive it as such. What would be the consequences if this were so? It would actually explain a great deal beyond some obscure problems in fundamental physics. Firstly, it would explain why we seem to live in a world of effect rather than a world of cause. We seem only able to measure effects. We have no idea how anything causes anything else in a final sense. All our so-called physical laws are merely catalogues of effects we have come to expect. Our power to actually cause events is illusory. We merely arrange things to make certain effects more probable. But we can't get hold of the root causes themselves. This is hardly surprising if we are unable to interact with the full dimensionality of an event. As the Kabbalists have said, the causal world exists as a hidden dimension. A fifth dimension to which the psyche had some limited access could explain all magical and occult phenomena without exception. Information moved through a fifth dimension could manifest at any point in ordinary time or space. Telepathy, necromancy, clairvoyance, and precognition are explained at a stroke. Transformations caused in the fifth dimension would appear as effects in ordinary reality. Telekinesis and all forms of spellcasting and enchantment are thus possible. Trying to make things happen in the ordinary world by arranging for effects is a laborious and time-consuming business. If we could gain access to the causal world, infinite power and possibility might be available at a whim, if we were still interested. The purpose of this study is not to rehabilitate science and magic, but to demonstrate that there are alternatives to irrationalism when it comes to erecting the theoretical basis of a magical modus operandi. If science ever did begin to make serious inquiry into magic, the result would be disaster. Humanity has proved itself totally incapable of handling even a moderately dangerous substance like plutonium with responsibility. Imagine what it would do with machine-enhanced sorcery or even simple, reliable telepathy. It is in the interests of the survival of the species that occultists continue to ridicule and discredit their own arts in the eyes of orthodox science. The author has a certain preference for paradigms of higher dimensionality, if only because the evolution of the simplest regular forms through increasing dimensionality leads one to profoundly familiar symbols shown together in Figure 1. Most magical paradigms envisage a total universe made up of three realities. Primary reality, the void, chaos, Ein Sof, or God, the Empyrean, Universe B, the Meon, the Pleroma, or plenum, mumu, the nagual, the archetypal or formative world, the fifth dimension, cosmic mind, the hologram, the night of Pan, hyperspace, acausality, quantum realm. Second reality, the ethers or astral, probability, the gods, morphic fields, the shadow world, the side, the wind, the astral light, potentia, aura, middle nature. Tertiary reality, the physical or material world, Malkuth, Universe A, the tonal, the fourth dimension, the body of God, the holograph, causality. And it is a further characteristic of all magical paradigms that there is an equivalence between the microcosm and macrocosm, as above, so below. Thus man contains a part of primary and secondary reality in addition to his physical being. Anecdotes. Each of these stories from the author's casebook is interesting, either because it illustrates a particular technique or the genesis of particular ideas appearing in this book. In some cases, details of precise locations are omitted or names changed to protect individuals. As far as possible, events are presented exactly as they happened to me. Perhaps it was because I was born and bred near to that part of the South Downs that holds both the remains of an ancient Romano-British temple at Canctonbury and a Templar stronghold at Steyning. Or perhaps it was because I have a psychic mother. I don't know, but I can still remember meeting strange entities in childhood dreams that were like elemental force fields, and having a persistent interest in witchcraft from my early teens. I remember clearly the first night I ever tried to make something happen. I was subject to the usual teenage frustrations arising mostly from sex, and used to fly into rages that I found tremendously exciting and exhilarating. I would sometimes take down some items from the collection of old swords and battle axes that I was permitted to keep in my room, and storm around wielding them at the air and working myself into a berserker rage for the hell of it. One evening, thus exhilarated, I went out for a walk still in the afterglow of one of these furies. Some distance ahead of me I saw a suitable unsuspecting victim in what looked like a bus inspector's uniform. From about 30 yards I deliberately loosed a bolt of energy at him by silently pointing and concentrating on his back. Almost immediately he jumped as if kicked violently in the backside. He turned to regard me with shock and surprise, and I, also shocked and surprised, feigned indifference. Then he covered his embarrassment and went off in another direction. I sincerely hope there were no lasting effects. It was motivated by nothing more than teenage hooliganism and curiosity, and I have rarely used it since. Most importantly, though, I now had proof that there must be something in all those old witchcraft books. My next discoveries occurred when I experimented with powerful hallucinogens at university. I had expected that these would show me my real soul, the center of the cyclone as it were. Instead, I saw that in the innermost core of my being there was only the power of will and the power of perception. Everything else was added on and could be stripped away. I began to see that under the apparent order of matter there was a spontaneous, creative, chaotic, magical force at work. These insights at first appalled me, and it was some years before I accepted and confirmed them. In the meantime, I took up meditation. At first I thought that meditation had brought me only calmness, for I had asked little more of it. Later I was to realize it had brought me a considerable degree of control, which was to prove useful in many ways. I began to record my dreams and found that a fantastic world could be opened up with perseverance. I several times dreamed of particular things which had just happened to my mother, with complete accuracy. Encouraged, I started to try and find my hands in dream as a preliminary to deliberate astral travel. It was then that I encountered the psychic censor. There is some part of one's mind that seems adamant that these experiences are out of bounds. The censor will go to almost any lengths to prevent one experiencing or remembering that one has experienced otherworld phenomena. It took me many months to get past this obstacle, but the result was well worth it. One night, a long-dead relative appeared in a dream. This was enough to shock me into action. Immediately, I found my hands and then pulled them away, and suddenly some part of myself was standing at a place I had arranged to visit, 15 miles away. The trip was instantaneous and like the sensation of bursting through a balloon. In all subsequent experiences, it has been the same. Suddenly, against some huge resistance, I pop through a sort of membrane, and I am allowed to stand and observe the desired place for a few moments before being whisked back. The details of the targets are always exactly as they should be without the usual dreamlike distortions. On the one occasion when I thought I had missed, I suddenly realized that I had arrived upside down at the scene, which was otherwise correct in all details. About this time I began to fool around with Austin Spare's death posture and his sigils. I shall not forget the first time I tried to experience an animal atavism through sigils. I had made a sigil to acquire the karma of a cat some days previously. Having concentrated on it for a while and obtained no result, I had more or less forgotten about it on the night that I was walking through a rather poorly lit alleyway in my hometown. I caught a glimpse of something moving to my right and turned to see a huge fat alley cat sitting on a gate post. In the moment that our eyes met, something indescribable flashed between us, and suddenly I tore off into the darkness, howling and screeching like a feline, completely possessed. Only the lack of grime on my hands afterward convinced me I was not on all fours. In the flats where I was living at the time in the big city, there was a chap making a progressive descent. Let us call him Ron. Most head doctor would have diagnosed Ron as paranoid schizophrenic. His behavior was bizarre in the extreme. He heard voices continually, and he imagined persecution from the most unlikely sources. One day he paid me a visit, drawn perhaps by rumors of my odd interests. He was dressed in perhaps 5 sets of clothes, starving, hungry, and almost completely out of his mind. He had been camping out on a heath for some time to avoid the demons in his flat. Having made him as comfortable as possible, I thought I should perhaps try and do anything I could to help. We went into a room I had prepared for various magical experiments, and I applied the standard procedures of exorcism. Nothing would work. Ron became very defensive and just kept mumbling a stream of dissociated nonsense. Nothing would make him manifest the demons he complained of, so that they could be banished. In exasperation, I decided to be his demon. I advanced upon him snarling and cursing, menacing him with weapons and threats, throwing back at him all the stuff he had been complaining of. For a few minutes, I became his paranoia. Clad in strange robes in a dark room full of burning sulfur, I held his soul at sword point and thoroughly evoked hell all about him. The effect was remarkable. He opened up and became completely lucid and reasonable, trying to talk his way out of the predicament, using perfect sense and logic with the correct emotional responses. Thereupon, I turned the act off and got us both out of the choking chamber. Ron was then normal for another 20 minutes, during which time we tried to work out how he was going to get his life back together. Towards the end of this, though, he began to slip back into his insane mode, and by the time he suddenly decided to leave, he was completely crazy again. It was my greatest regret that I didn't have the facilities to detain him and try and do something more for him. As the witch doctors say, a man who gets sick in the head can be helped, but a man with a bad soul, that is, a long-term head case, often proves intractable. I only saw Ron briefly, once again after the psychiatrists had had their way with him, and he seemed a virtual cabbage. Let's hope it was only sedatives. Around this time I had my first successes with Spare's death posture. After some months of practice, I suddenly entered a strange ecstatic state, which was exhilarating beyond my wildest expectations, and seemed to be the gateway to certain magical experiences. I would find myself hovering as a point of awareness outside of my body entirely, and was allowed to examine the ball of ectoplasmic force that each of us contains in this midsection. My capacity for tantrums of raging anger sometimes reasserted itself when events became trying. On one occasion, I had lost my door keys in the riot of my flat and was late for an appointment. I stormed around from room to room, overturning every possible hiding place to no avail, getting more and more angry. Eventually, I stood in the center of the main room and screamed and roared my frustration out. Suddenly, the keys appeared in midair, just off my right shoulder, and fell to the ground.
I swept them up without a thought and hurled myself out the front door. It wasn't till I was 50 yards up the road that the full force of what I had done dawned on my thinking mind. It still tends to give me the creeps. Shortly after I set off on a low-budget trip around the world, this proved to be an excellent way of sharpening up magical abilities. Long periods of enforced inactivity crossing deserts and long periods of quiet in the Himalayan mountains seemed to bring out a capacity for telepathy. The avoidance of the hazards associated with travel on the cheap is a further stimulus. If human life is precarious in India, then the life of an Indian dog must be about the most demanding and competitive lifestyle possible. As a result, Indian dogs have evolved an intelligence rarely matched by their bloated and pampered relatives in Western countries. You would need to be half psychic to survive as a dog in India, and several that I met were. One in particular would leave whatever he was doing and come to me within a few minutes if I thought intently about him. There were many Tibetan Buddhist monks in a mountain village I stayed at. Their people are credited with some quite extraordinary abilities. One day, sitting on top of a low building overlooking the market, I decided to see if I could influence one of their number. Selecting one of the red-robed, shaven-headed monks at random as he entered the market, I commanded him to stop. This he did, despite the fact that he was standing in the middle of the street. Turn around, I thought. He complied. I let him walk back 10 steps the way he had come, and then projected the suggestion again. A second time he retracted his steps after turning around again. When he regained his first position, I sent the message a third time. At this he stopped, looked about himself in a confused way, shook his head, and walked determinedly off on his original route. I had lost him. Thinking about it afterward, I suppose it was not really all that clever. Those monks spend all day meditating, and it's not surprising that they are receptive to that sort of thing. Returning eventually to England, I discovered that autumnal fungi were the subject of much interest. A fellow sorcerer took me out at the beginning of the season and picked me a handful of the aforesaid sacrament, which I ate fresh. About an hour later, lying down in my friend's attic, a magnificent and beautiful vision showed itself to me. It was of a glowing segmented body surmounted by fabulous diaphanous wings. It rotated itself before me so that I could inspect it for some moments and then was gone. It was not till I went out mushroom hunting a second time that I realized what the vision was. On the second mushroom hunt, I observed that numerous little gnats were buzzing between the mushrooms. When we put some of the mushrooms to dry on a paper, a number of tiny maggots emerged. I had swallowed several of them in the first dose and somehow picked up on their being. Had I met the lord of the gnats, perhaps? These are just a few of the easier-to-explain experiments and experiences that have come my way during my years of involvement with magic. Many hundreds of instances of telepathy, precognition, coincidence, and spellcasting must go unrecorded. I no longer regard these things as strange and unusual. The greatest mystery to me now is why these things are not always accessible and available to us all the time. I consider that anybody who is prepared to strive against his own resistance to these phenomena, the psychic censor, will achieve results. Catastrophe theory and magic. Catastrophe theory is a mathematical tool which allows sudden discontinuous changes to be represented by a topological model. Topology is sometimes called rubber sheet geometry, in which a form can be distorted in any way so long as the basic features remain unaltered. The theory provides a qualitative, but not a quantitative, description of how a sudden change is likely to occur. It tells us that something unusual is to be expected under certain conditions, but it does not tell us exactly when to expect it. It does, however, tell us how to provoke catastrophes. The theory is here applied to situations like initiation, illumination, and religious conversion, where there is a sudden change of state. In each case, the theory describes the situation satisfactorily, and also throws up much that is unexpected and valuable. It was originally my taste for perfidious wisdom that drew my attention to a theory that most mathematicians still consider black magic. But having found it to have a certain applicability to magic, I present it herewith. Catastrophe theory. I will use mainly the cusp catastrophe model shown in Figure 2. The sheet with the kink in it
is the catastrophe surface across which a point representing behavior can move. The z direction is the behavior axis, and the higher up the axis on the surface it is, the more of a particular behavior it will show. A is the highest point, B is a little lower, D is a lower still, and C is the lowest point. The y-axis is a control factor which tends to move behavior from D to B or from C to A when it is applied. The x-axis is a second control factor which causes catastrophes. When there is a large factor of x, any change from A to C or back again will not be a smooth one, but will be a sudden change as the point falls over the edge of the fold back down onto another part of the surface. Thus, if the behavior is at point B or D, a change in the amounts of x or y will cause only smooth continuous changes. However, if the behavior is at point A or C, any large change in y will result in a catastrophic change as the point falls over the fold. Figure 2 shows the model for the catastrophe theory, and Figure 3 shows the catastrophe theory applied to occult versus materialist world views. Here the points represent the following: A. Tough-minded occultists, B. Tough-minded materialists, and C. Sloppy-minded occultists, and D. Sloppy-minded materialists. Unfortunately, I cannot explain the diagrams to you. You would have to purchase the book. Applications of the catastrophe theory, occult versus materialist worldviews. This model represents occult versus materialist worldviews. The control factors are Y, the amount of magical experiences the subject remembers having perceived, and X, the degree to which the subject is tough-minded or rigorous about what he remembers having perceived. See Figure 3. The transitions. B to D, an oscillation characteristic of popular occultism where each bit of uncritically accepted nonsense changes one's mind for the few days that one can remember it. D to C, an increasing sophistication of materialist outlook caused by scientific study and rationalization. B to A, an increasing sophistication of occult outlook caused by magical study and rationalization. D to A gradual growth of an occult viewpoint caused by study of magical theories and exposure to magical experiences. And C to a sudden and discontinuous change to occult worldview caused by exposure to magical experiences. Transitions away from A are unlikely as they would involve eliminating experiences from memory. Any scheme of magical training aims to produce state A in which the subject can be discriminating about occult experience. Some masters insist on a course of mental training that initially forces the pupil into state C, so that he can then make the catastrophe revision of worldview to A on being exposed to magical experiences. I tend to regard the route D to A, a gradual increase in both objectivity and experience, as the easiest route to engineer, although the general purpose of this book is to provoke B to A transitions. Applications of the catastrophe theory, change of belief. We can also use the catastrophe model to show a change from one belief to another. The control factors are Y, emotional commitment to one belief or the other, and X, rationality and irrationality, as shown in Figure 4. Types of belief 1 and 2 can range from the ideological to the religious and include such beliefs as disbelief. Figure 4 shows the catastrophe theory applied to a change from one belief to another. A and C represent strong beliefs that are both emotional and irrational. B and D represent beliefs that are emotional and rational. Note how the element of rationality causes a decrease in the strength of the beliefs. Once again, it is unfortunate that I cannot present to you these diagrams. You would have to purchase the book. The transitions. A through B or B through A and C through D or D through C merely represent the weakening and strengthening of belief by the increase or decrease of rationality. This increase of belief with irrationality corresponds to religious revivalism and nationalism. B through D or D through B represents oscillation between rationally held beliefs 1 and 2 on an emotional basis. A through C or C through A represents catastrophic change of irrationally held beliefs 1 through 2 or 2 through 1 caused by change of emotional commitment, for example, religious conversion. A through D, D through A, and B through C, C through B are possible. A further phenomenon can be shown on the catastrophe surface, that of bifurcation,
or splitting as shown in Figure 5. This figure shows how a descent into irrationality produces two possibilities for strong belief which are very unstable with respect to emotional commitment. This is a technique that has its uses in magic. Applications of the catastrophe theory, mystical initiation. The control factors are Y, mystical knowledge, and X, mystical power, expertise with gnosis, as shown in Figure 6. Figure 6 shows the catastrophe theory applied to mystical initiation. Here the points represent the following: A, illuminated mystic, B, knowledgeable mystic, C, someone with power but no knowledge, and D, beginner. Also, Figure 5 shows this is an extrapolation of Figure 4 and shows the phenomenon of bifurcation or splitting. Unfortunately, once again, I cannot show you the diagrams. You would have to purchase the book. Transitions, D through A. A gradual increase in both knowledge and power, followed by the better systems. D through B through A, knowledge first, power later, a process which, although safe, may never satisfactorily be completed in time. D through C, power first, knowledge later. This type of training or experience often produces hearsay or madness. Many mystic masters say that power on its own actually removes the candidate further from the objective of mystical initiation and erects a catastrophe barrier to further progress. Applications of the catastrophe theory, magical initiation. The control factors are Y power and X knowledge. In a magical initiation, the control factors operate the other way around because the structures of the knowledge and power are different, as are their effects on the candidate. It is often simply this difference which leads magicians and mystics to denigrate each other's systems. See Figure 7. Figure 7 saying, the catastrophe theory applied to magical initiation. Here the points represent A, illuminated magician, B, powerful but unwise magician, C, one who is merely full of ideas, and D, the beginner. And finally, Figure 8, an extrapolation of Figure 7, is the double catastrophe surface. Unfortunately, once again, I cannot provide you with the diagrams. You would have to purchase the book. The transitions, D through A gradual increase in both knowledge and power. D through B, power first, a dangerous path which may lead the candidate into disaster. And D through C, knowledge first. This type of training usually produces only a dilatant. Thus we see why mystic masters denigrate power for its own sake, and magical masters denigrate knowledge for its own sake. Each moves the candidate further from his objective and necessitates a catastrophic change to achieve the desired effect. Power on its own in magic and knowledge on its own in mysticism do at least bring the candidate some way forward. Both these schemes can be combined in a double catastrophe surface, for which I hope the originator of the theory will forgive me. See Figure 8. Points B and C are on Labor Null and Psychonaut, the most creative and refreshing approach to magic that has been offered for many a year. In these two books, published in one volume, Carroll stands towering on the shoulders of his occult predecessors, Aleister Crowley and Austin Osman Spare. But he is truly original in his approach to his work, and shows that the magician does not attain mastery haphazardly or mysteriously. Labor Null contains powerful rituals and exercises for committed occultists who are aware of their own being. Psychonaut, the companion to Labor Null, is a manual comprising the theory and practice of magic, aimed at those who seek to perform group magic or who work as shamanic priests to the community. Both treatises will serve as invaluable guides to the operation of real magic, the quest for adeptship, and spiritual illumination through the Western magical path. A welcome treat to the experienced occultist, this book will also provide a coherent and original series of magical instructions for the serious student.